We're live. And that means we're broadcasting live, so the people in the state and everywhere else can participate. So today, we have a number of bills. We have a lot smaller group here for an audience, but these bills are every bit as important as what we discussed yesterday. So with that, let's see, I'm looking at my calendar. We'll start with oil and gas bonding, consideration of two bill drafts. Brian, I'll ask you to go through both of those drafts so that we can kind of compare them, and then we'll move on to an explanation.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this topic is one for which a working group was assigned consisting of Senator Rothfuss, Representative Western, Representative Lawley, Representative Banks, and Senator Ellis. And these two bill drafts come from the work of that working group. Both drafts generally would require the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to promulgate rules to establish bonding options, including the creation of a bonding pool for oil and gas operators who operate on federal lands. The structures of the drafts are similar, but they are different. And just very broadly, before I get into the details of each, 25 LSO 92, which is working draft 0.5, it's 10-02 in the meeting materials. This draft would authorize the commission to, two prongs. The commission could either create a bonding pool to be used for these operators, and I'll go into more detail in a minute, or the commission can promulgate rules to contract with a third party to provide that bonding pool. 141, the key difference is that the commission would be required to promulgate rules for that third party only. So that's the key difference between the two bills. So starting with draft 92, starting on page 2, line 5, this would require, and just one, I guess, additional background note, unlike the Environmental Quality Act, the oil and gas bonding, there are very few references to this in statute. And this was addressed in a summary that was provided to the committee back in May. There's primarily one reference in statute that requires the commission to establish rules for a surety bond or other guarantee for the plugging and abandoning of dry wells, or abandoned wells, excuse me. So starting on page 2, this follows a similar tack. The commission would be required to promulgate rules to establish bonding options, in addition to those that are required currently under law and commission rule for operators requiring bonds for producing oil or gas on federal lands in Wyoming. And then the remainder of the subsection describes what those rules must contain. So first, the rules would apply to operators who produce oil or gas on federal land located in Wyoming. This bonding option, these programs that are established under this section, are voluntary on the part of the operator. Second, page 2, line 16, this would require operators to comply with all current bonding requirements specified in the oil and gas statutes and in the rules of the commission. The staff comment on the bottom of page 2 just notes, maybe the committee may wish to consider the interplay between state requirements and requiring those state requirements, particularly for an operator who is only operating on federal land, for example. Then page 3, line 5, this is the language that would establish the bonding pool that the commission would manage. And this bonding pool would serve as a secondary level of financial assurance for the plugging of dry or abandoned wells, for the forfeiture of an operator's applicable federal bonds. The bonding pool would be managed by the commission. It would require operators to be in compliance with all bonding requirements and the commission's rules, and it would require operators to maintain compliance during the participation in this pool. And then the pool participation would be limited first to operators who are producing oil or gas on federal lands until a date that is specified later. How would this bonding pool be funded? And that is on page 4, line 7. It would be funded by contributions from each operator participating in the bonding pool. And the commission would be authorized to impose an assessment on each operator on the fair cash market value on all oil and gas produced, sold, or transported from the operator's wells that are covered under this section. So generally those wells that are producing on federal land. And it would be a charge not to exceed, and this would be a point that the committee would need to decide however many mils on the dollar that would be contributed as an assessment and then deposited into this newly created Wyoming bonding pool account. Those funds would be invested by the treasurer in accordance with law, and it's used exclusively to pay the costs and expenses of plugging or repairing dry and abandoned wells, and the costs of the forfeiture of any federal bonds, if applicable. And this would only be used if the operator's financial assurance or surety bond or other guarantee is insufficient to perform the plugging or abandoning or to address the forfeiture of a federal bond. This bonding pool would also be authorized to accept additional funds from other sources authorized by law. One additional note just on page 4 that is not included in this bill draft, I don't recall this coming up during the working group's discussions, is to specify the disposition of earnings from the funds being invested, if they should be deposited right into this account or go somewhere else. Then on page 5, similar concept, except in lieu of establishing that bonding pool that the commission would manage, this is on page 5, line 5, the commission can establish a process where it would contract with any person to establish a bonding pool instead of being run by the commission. Similar to the first option, this bonding pool would allow the commission to impose an assessment on the operator up to a certain amount of mils per dollar that the committee would have to decide. Funds that are collected under this subparagraph would be expended only on the plugging and abandoning of dry wells. The operators participating, if this bonding pool option is used, operators would have to remain in good standing and in compliance with the oil and gas statutes and the commission's rules. And if the commission does go this route with that third party, they would report that, this is on page 6, line 6, they would report that fact to this committee and the Joint Appropriations Committee that they have contracted with a third party to establish this bonding pool. Page 6, line 13 just specifies that if the commission does enter into a contract with a third party, they must ensure that the funds in the bonding pool are expended only for the cost of plugging or repairing of dry or abandoned wells and for the forfeiture of any applicable federal bonds for the operators participating in this bonding pool. Page 6, line 21 is a further backstop to this bonding pool. And this would require the commission to establish a financial assurance to address any expenses that are associated with plugging in accordance with subsection B, which is slightly later. Page 7, line 4 would require the commission to, as part of these rules, to establish a process by which an operator in good standing with the commission and who is participating in this bonding pool may reduce requirements associated with the furnishing of a surety bond or other guarantee in accordance with the act. The concept behind this paragraph is that if the bonding pool reaches a sufficient funding level to address any issues with plugging or repairing wells that are dry or abandoned, then there may be a point where other bonding requirements may be modified to account for that larger balance in that pool. Before doing so, though, the commission must complete a risk analysis to ensure that that reduction does not increase the risk that an operator will be unable to satisfy all plugging and repairing requirements or impair the financial condition of the Wyoming bonding pool. On page 8, line 4, the commission would be required to establish a process by which the commission would remove an operator from participation in the bonding pool if the operator fails to maintain compliance with the requirements of this section or if the operator is no longer in good standing with the commission. The staff comment is just a note for the working group, and there was some discussion in this. And the consideration would be whether other requirements should be specified in statute for the removal of an operator. So for example, should there be a process for refunding contributions, notice and comment, things like that. Finally, page 8, line 25 would require the commission to provide for the transfer of an operator's financial assurance to another operator if necessary to ensure that another operator could participate in the bonding options established under this section. that transfer could not take place until the commission completes a bonding review of the operator to whom the financial assurance would be transferred or the participation in the program. Page 9, line 4, this is kind of that third backstop behind the bonding pool. These are the requirements for that. So the commission would establish a financial assurance if the surety bond or other guarantee is insufficient, and if the Wyoming bonding pool account is insufficient to address the operator's obligations. For establishing this financial assurance, the commission would be able to expend, this is page 9, line 14, any unexpended and unobligated funds that are available in the conservation fund, which is established in 35-116B. The commission must also ensure that the financial assurance would satisfy all bonding requirements for operations on federal lands. On page 10, it would authorize the commission to contract with any third party to provide for this financial assurance. And as part of this assurance, the commission would be authorized to expend any unexpended and unobligated funds from the bonding pool or the conservation fund. The commission may also contract, page 10, line 9, with a company that is certified with the Department of Treasury's Bureau of the Fiscal Service as an approved surety bond company. For federal bonding, an operator must use a surety bond company that has been approved by the federal government in order for that bond to be acceptable to the applicable federal agency. The commission would also be authorized to enter into any agreement with the United States or any federal agency to ensure that the financial assurance that is established here would satisfy federal bonding requirements. And then a limitation on page 10, line 20. So the commission would not be authorized to expend any funds under this subsection unless the surety bond or other guarantee and the Wyoming bonding pool are insufficient to address the operator's expenses for plugging or repairing. If the commission does expend funds under this subsection as this kind of third level financial assurance, not later than 10 days after doing so, the commission must report to this committee and the Joint Appropriations Committee. Page 11, line 10, starting July 1, 2026, the commission would be authorized to promulgate rules to allow any oil and gas operator in Wyoming to participate in the bonding pool that's established in this bill draft. Page 11, line 17, authorizes the commission to enter into agreements with the United States or any federal agency to provide for the plugging or repairing of the wells. The idea behind this subsection is that instead of a forfeiture of an operator's federal bond, the commission could enter into an agreement and use the operator's surety bond or other guarantee that's provided to the commission or the conservation fund to complete those plugging and or the plugging requirements. That's outlined on page 12, lines 4 through 10. Then page 12, line 12 is more of a specifying applicability. So unless it's specifically authorized in this section, nothing in this new section is construed to abrogate an operator's responsibility to furnish a surety bond or other guarantee or complete any plugging, repairing, or reclamation in accordance with the requirements of this section and the rules. Mr. Chairman, the remainder of the bill draft are conforming amendments. The change on page 13, beginning on line 21, amends the subsection of statute concerning the conservation fund to authorize the use of those funds as part of this bond program. The changes on page 15, line 9, and then page 15, line 22 are just conforming amendments to reference the new section of statute. There'd be rulemaking and then a split effective date. And Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to stop for questions now, or I can proceed briefly with 141.
Let's go to 141, Brian, and that way the committee can get a comparison. For the committee, briefly, the concept here is we come out of this with one bill. We can't have two bills kind of doing the same thing. So we'll have one bill. The idea was to give the committee some choices and some different concepts and that, and we will carry these over. We aren't going to move them forward today. After we combine them or pick one, we'll carry that over into October and use the same working committee to come up with a final draft. Brian, go ahead, proceed with 141.
So, Mr. Chairman, 25 LSO 141, this is 10-03 in the online materials. This is very similar to 92, so I'm not going to go through it line by line as I did the first draft.
Brian, why don't you just pick out the differences or the different concept?
Yep, okay. So Mr. Chairman, I'll start then on page 3, line 11. So similar to the previous draft, The commission would have to promulgate rules to establish these bonding options. The key difference in this draft is that the only option for the commission would be they must contract with a person to establish that bonding pool. So instead of having the option to either create and operate its own bonding pool or contract with a third party, this bill draft would say, commission, go contract with a third party to establish that bonding pool to help meet the federal bonding requirements. Similar to 92, the bonding pool would be established either with an assessment that the commission may impose, and that is on page 4, line 5. And if those funds are insufficient, then the commission would be authorized to use any unexpended and unobligated funds in the conservation fund. That's on page 4, line 19. Similar to the other bill draft, they can expend these only on reclamation and plugging requirements. The commission can enter into an agreement with the federal government to provide for the plugging or repairing in lieu of forfeiture. It would require an annual report. That's another key difference. This draft would require an annual report from the commission to this committee and joint appropriations on the bonding program. And then page 6, lines 1 through 9 specify at a minimum what must be in that report. Mr. Chairman, the remainder of the bill draft is the same conforming amendments. With that, I would stand for questions.
Okay. Any questions for staff? Okay. Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick clarification, sorry. Plug-in requirements between 92 and 141 are still the same, correct?
Yep. Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, I apologize. My question is between our 92 and 141, the plug-in requirements are still the same.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, nothing in either bill draft changes the requirements for plugging, repairing, or reclamation.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Senator Rothfuss, would you give the committee just a brief summary of the concept, the work and the thought process here, the logic, the reasons, all of that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we had 4 two-hour meetings to work through this, and we had great participation from stakeholders. I think everyone's familiar with the purpose to try and provide more flexibility under the new federal rules, where you have a $500,000 blanket statewide bond plus well bonding, which is going to cause problems for our small operators. We heard extensive testimony on that. The concept would be to try and provide some risk pooling to allow the state to help our producers lower that blanket bond while still effectively providing the required surety that is needed. We had 2 processes that we explored. One was effectively a state primary option. We worked that through, and then we started to learn, and we'll have more testimony on that in a few moments, learn about some potential private solutions. So we drafted the second bill and amended to some degree the first bill to allow for the private option. I can tell you that the direction of our working group at this point in time would be to effectively merge those 2 bills. We want to make sure that the state option continues to be available in case a private option falls through. We want a solution, and we want a solution to be there, but we have a lot of enthusiasm about the availability of these private solutions as a working group. So we certainly don't want either of these bills in their current form passed. The right answer is going to be merging the 2, providing the OGCC with the flexibility to explore and work with our community and private solutions to try and get to a robust private solution, but ensure that they have the tools necessary where if they had to do it alone, they would be able to do it alone, which is the core content of the first process. I'll stop there so that we can get to the other testimony, which I think is an important part of coloring this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Senator. So, okay, committee, I think with that, I'll have Director Kropatch and Mr. Obermuller and Tony, I'm sorry, I did not catch your last name, but you can introduce yourself when you get up here, and they're going to run through the bill. Sanchez. Okay, thank you, Tony, sorry. And, yep. So why don't you, each of you just go ahead and introduce yourself for the record and then proceed.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Tom Kropatch. I'm the Oil and Gas Supervisor for the Oil and Gas Commission.
Remember to turn the mics on, or the people out
There we go.
in the electronic world can't.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman, my name is Tony Sanchez. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called One Nexus.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Pete Obermueller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming.
Mr. Chairman, member of the committee, Tom Van Cleef, Oil Mountain Energy, and I also have the honor of working with Senator Rothfuss and the other members of the working group on the bill.
Director Kropatch, before we start, just for a reminder for the committee, would you explain the conservation fund for the committee so they know we're one of the sources of money we're talking about?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the Conservation Fund is a tax essentially paid by industry on their sales of oil and gas. The commission's entire funding essentially comes from the conservation tax, so industry pays that. We can go up to 0.8 of a mil on the tax. It's currently set at 0.5 of a mil. The commission has authority from the statutes to change that up to 8 by a rulemaking. And so, as I said, it covers almost all of the commission's operations, including its orphaned and abandoned well program. And we do get a small grant from the federal government for our UIC program, which is our other funding.
Okay, thank you, Director. So just briefly on the bill, and I know Mr. Obermueller, we've talked, Mr. Sanchez will make a very fine presentation, I know, for the committee, for those who have not heard his presentation. So, Mr. Obermueller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and thanks so much to the work group for all the work. As Senator Rothfuss pointed out, it was a very active work group, 4 two-hour meetings where we talked extensively about options and potential pitfalls and all of that, and came out with these 2 draft proposals to bring to the full committee for discussion. Just by way of background, I think you recall that really what this conversation started about how to thinking of creative ways to deal with bonding in Wyoming about 5 or 6 years ago, actually related to can we think of ways that can help release capital for our smallest operators, that money tied up in bonds, so that our small operators, which, as you know, make up about 1/3 of total oil production in Wyoming, 85% of businesses are small businesses. How can we release capital on the state bonding side? And the idea of a pool came up, and it kind of stop and start, and we'd think of things that didn't go through. And then what happened, as you know, recently is the federal government's change to the minimum bonding requirement really lit a fire. And in my time at PAW, there's not been any other issue that has raised the interest and the concern of the small operators in Wyoming than this federal minimum bonding rule, which the rule itself went into effect July 1. There's a phased-in process for the minimum bonds over the course of the next 2-3 years on the federal side. What's happening right now is if you're a new company with a new permit in Wyoming, you're right now subject to the new bonding rules. If you're an existing company and you have a new permit, that's phased in a year, and then existing permits in 2 years everybody will be at the minimum bond. So that's what lit a fire and started this discussion. The bill concepts actually are scalable to deal with the bonding requirements across the board. So I just want to point out, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Van Cleef, because quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, I want to save as much time for Mr. Sanchez as possible, because I think his presentation is very interesting, and I really want the committee to spend some time with it. I mentioned the small operators and the 1/3 of revenue, the 1/3 of production that comes from small operators, and Wyoming's interest in making sure that small operators can continue. The small operators are the ones that keep our legacy fields going and keep wells, sometimes significantly old wells in production and in productive use. And there's a significant interest for Wyoming as a state to make sure that that happens, and that we don't move arbitrarily or too quickly towards closure of those wells as a result, particularly of federal bonding requirements. The other thing about, I wanted to mention just as an overall matter is what's interesting about this particular proposal and the bills in front of you that allow this to happen is that it's a paradigm shift in how we think about funding closure of wells at the end of their life. Right now we have the bonding requirements and all of that, and then on the federal side, the bonding requirements go back title ownership to the beginning of time and to capture revenue in order to plug and abandon orphan wells. This is a different concept that allows in a voluntary way for operators to rather than think about their obligation as a bond obligation, to think about it as more of an insurance obligation. And they can release their early capital, their early investment, and instead over time, similar to insurance, pay premiums so that the revenue exists at the end of the life cycle, no matter who owns it, whether it's the state, not the state never's going to own it, whether it's the original operator, I should say, a secondary operator, a tertiary operator, or it's completely abandoned, that the revenue exists to deal with P&A and reclamation no matter what. And that's a paradigm shift. And that's why, and making that successful not only helps prolong the life of small operators and their operating wells, but also protects in the long term any of the state's potential obligation. There's very minimal in Wyoming anyway, but any potential obligation for P&A and reclamation. So that's just a quick, really high-level overview of it. I'll turn it over to Mr. Van Cleef if he wants to add any high-level stuff for now, and then give it to Mr. Sanchez.
I'll slide over. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. Again, I'd like to start out by thanking the members of the working group because I'm a small operator. The interests of the state and the small operators, but primarily the interests of the state, were incredibly well represented. And thank you for all of that. I really do appreciate that. As Mr. Obermuller said, this is a paradigm shift, what we're looking at, because as a small operator, I have a responsibility to have funding to plug and abandon those wells. If I sell my wells, which are in federal property, 20 years from now, some operator who I don't know walks away from those wells for some reason, I'm on the hook for those wells, okay? Or my children are, or my grandchildren are. What this gives us the opportunity to do is not only meet the bond requirements, which are essential, but it allows us to do something which is unique in the industry. We get to put money in, and money gets set aside, so at the end of the well's life, there is money there, there's capital there to plug that well. And that's something that even with my friends who are larger operators, they don't always have to do that. So this is an interesting portion. As Pete said, this is critical to the state. And let me talk about the state issues here for a second. Yes, 85% of the industry are small operators. It's 400, you've all heard this, say it on the record. It's 470 small businesses. It's 24,000 Wyoming households. It's 15% of the state's budget. Now, if somebody can come up with an answer, we have friends who just don't understand what it is we're trying to do. And our hope here is today that we'll help them understand that. We have friends who don't understand. We have organizations who might not have the best, they've got an agenda. If those organizations, if those people, if those groups, after hearing this, can come up with 470 small businesses, if they can come up and provide income for 24,000 Wyoming households, if they can provide 15% of the state's budget, please have them come forward and give us those answers. They got to be able to do it in 22 months, because that's our timeline. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Mr. Franklin. So Director Kropatch, anything before Mr. Sanchez?
No, Mr. Chairman, I think it'd be good to have Mr. Sanchez provide his presentation, and then we could kind of talk questions and bills and how that all might fit together.
Mr. Sanchez, go ahead and proceed. Let the committee know your concepts, your.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and in the working group as well. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. For logistics, do I just say page turn, or how does the?
Just say
Okay,
next slide.
okay, thank you. I want to start by saying that I really appreciate the time to be here this morning. We formed One Nexus with a singular focus, which was to solve this exact problem, and to do it in a way that was friendly to the industry and beneficial to the operator. What Mr. Van Cleef described earlier is a situation I've lived through. I've been an operator in Texas and Louisiana. I've drilled wells, fracked wells, produced wells, plugged wells, acquired wells, and sold wells. Some of the wells that we have sold, particularly ones in Louisiana, many years ago, did come back to bite us under some of the problems that these two gentlemen had described earlier, where they had been sold down the line, and eventually there was no operator, so the regulator came back and asked us to plug and fund the plugging and the cleanup of those wells. So about 3 years ago, some business partners and I from the oil and gas industry, and we've grown since then, we've gotten some non-oil and gas industry experts involved as well, decided to form One Nexus for the sole purpose of solving this funding problem for the P&A and the reclamation of wells that are no longer producing. Can you go to the next slide, please? 2 slides, actually. Okay, so the whole concept here is to keep funding within the system. It's important, let's see, go to the next slide, actually. So the problem here is something that we've all described. I'm not gonna sit on it too long, but essentially an oil and gas well is a depleting asset. And at some point, the time to plug and abandon that well, to remediate the surface, to remove all of the surface equipment and things like that, keeps getting closer and closer, and that expense becomes larger than the remaining reserves in the ground. This is the problem that the industry has been plagued by since day one. Since day one, there has been no funding set aside for that ultimate liability that's going to come due for every single one of these wells. It's a legal obligation that the operators have to plug the wells. It is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, so Mr. Obermueller described that prior owners are ultimately going to be stuck with the bill. So there's been no funding set aside. Next slide, please. And the solution to this is very simple. Start setting aside a little bit of money every year in anticipation of this ultimate liability. To do so in a protected, safe, secure structure. So we formed One Nexus as a company that is an insurance company. We're domiciled in Oklahoma. And our product is called Well Secure. And the concept here is really to provide funding for whoever owns that well when the end of the life of that well comes. This may sound familiar in terms of structure. It's like life insurance. This is life insurance for oil and gas wells and the producing assets. When it comes time to plug the well, and when that well is no longer generating revenue, right, under the current existing structure, the producer has to come out, the operator has to come out of pocket to plug the well. So no more cash flow generated from the well, then the operator has to come out with money from somewhere else to go plug that well. Along the way, the solution provided so far, historically, has been surety bonds. Surety bonds don't work for a long-term liability like this because it takes money out of the system. So our concept with One Nexus has been very simple: keep money in the system. The details of what I'm going to describe are how we do that, but the basic concept here is a very simple one: is instead of having money leave the system to go pay a surety bonding carrier, keep money within the system under a structure by which that capital will be available to the ultimate operator who plugs the well. So that all the bad things that we've talked about here today don't occur, or they're mitigated. Meaning, if that well becomes orphaned, or it's idle, or that producer has no more money to plug the well, who's going to plug it? Many cases, it falls to the taxpayer under different jurisdictions. So that said, surety bonds are required by federal statute under the BLM, and in many states, they're simply required. Over the last several years, what we've seen across the United States, and you're seeing it here with the BLM in Wyoming, is that surety bonding requirements have increased. So with that increase comes increased financial strain on oil and gas operators, which is a double whammy because the production from those wells is as depleting assets decline over time. So can you go two slides forward, please? Thank you. So this is in general. I have a slide in the deck, and I brought some printed copies, and we'll send some more y'all would like. But we come up with the concept here that we've come up with, we've enacted, we're in business, we have underwritten several thousand wells already in Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico, has been to create a funding mechanism for this liability. Our product that I described, the brand name's WellSecure, but the contract is called an asset retirement agreement. We enter into an asset retirement agreement with the producer. That asset retirement agreement basically is like a life insurance policy. That's the life insurance policy that I described earlier, where the producer would pay in a small amount of money every year, and that money would basically be held in a secured and backstopped insurance company called One Nexus Oklahoma Captive Corp. So that funding is available. We have set this up to outlast all of us. This is these are wells, many wells here across the country are going to last another 50 to 100 years. Some wells are due today. Some wells are going to be due in a year. Some wells are going to be not due for another 50 years in terms of when they have to be plugged. So we run our analysis, and we basically set up this structure where whoever has the well at the end of that well's life can file a claim and be paid funds to plug those wells. And until that comes out, that capital is held in an insurance company here. Next slide, please. And I'm going to just touch on this real quick. It's not just One Nexus. So as a regulated insurance company in Oklahoma, we're subject to the Oklahoma Insurance Department's regulations, frankly. So we have to carry a certain amount of what's called risk-based capital against the commitments that we enter into with these contracts. That risk-based capital is provided by one of the largest insurance companies on the planet, Munich Re. They're firmly behind this. They think that this is the right way to provide for future funding of these types of liabilities. Next slide, please. Out of the gate, they have supported us to enter into contracts of size between $1 to $2 billion in size. So they're really thinking about this as the ultimate solution for providing for funding for these liabilities that are going to come due starting today for the next 100 years. And in a manner and a structure that will not burden taxpayers should these liabilities not be met by the operators in question when they ultimately come due. It was very important for us to really focus on three main themes here: the permanency of our solution, the security of our solution, and the guaranteed nature of our solution. And those are three themes that I'm going to hit on here throughout this presentation. Permanency. This is done in a regulated structure. If Tony, me goes away, this is done in a structure that is meant to outlast all of us. It's administered by the staff of One Nexus. It'll be administered, and I'm going to get into what our plan here would be with the state of Wyoming, but in conjunction with the rules and regulations of the commission in Wyoming that you all would want to apply to your operators. Security, I've touched on this. It's in a regulated structure. We're subject to the Oklahoma Insurance Department statute. We have independent third-party actuaries We have insurance company, independent managers, not one Nexus employees, but a third-party manager that entered into this. And then I'm going to talk about the guaranteed nature of this structure here in a bit. Next slide, please. So we've touched on this a little bit. Here, what's important here, I would say, is the guaranteed structure is backed by Munich Re, which is a AA rated global insurance company. Now, let me get into the heart of the matter here on slide 11. Next slide, please. Long before we participated in the working group call with Wyoming, we brought to forth this pooling structure and the pooling idea. This is what we do. This is how we're structured. It would be very easy for us to put a structure in place that would apply to the 400+ small operators in Wyoming in support of their BLM bonding requirements. We've been working with the BLM as well. So for 2.5 years now, we've been working with the BLM, and they from inception, their idea was headed towards increased bonding requirements. We've tried to talk to them about coming up with alternative forms of financial assurance, which is one that we would provide. However, what they came out with in their most recent rulemaking was more surety bonds, higher requirements of more surety bonds. Oil and gas operators are really, in many cases living, paycheck to paycheck, and so now they have to come up with more bonding. Not only do they have to come up with more bonding, but the surety bonding industry itself is tightening because of certain things that have happened in the Gulf of Mexico, ESG requirements that you've seen, we've all heard about over the last several years. And so the bottom line from the bonding perspective and surety industry's perspective is they're making it more difficult to acquire surety bonds. The rate paid on that surety bond is going up, and the collateral requirements in support of those surety bonds are going up. So the amounts are going up, and they're making it a lot more difficult to go up, and oil and gas wells are depleting. It's just the oil and gas wells are a depleting asset that happens every single day. So it's a double whammy for the operator, and it hurts. And we're seeing this across the country where mom and pop operators, even small to medium size operators, are struggling to find access to surety at rates that they could afford, frankly. So what we've been working on here with the working group is that private market solution. I'm going to talk about ours. This is the one I know and I know best. But it's very simple. We pool these assets, and we could set up a structure for Wyoming where we will have a pooling structure within our broader setup here to work with the funding support that the commission is willing to provide in support of these operators with one simple objective: to get operators access to surety bonds at a preferred rate with little to no collateral. Operators can go to their surety carrier currently, and they could request a bond. If they have to post a $500,000 bond today in Wyoming for federal lands, that is probably going to come at a rate that is higher than they have paid in the past, along with collateral requirements. You got to put up cash. You got to put up cash deposits, CDs, or letters of credit. And the letter of credit will require some collateral support at the bank. So there's no escaping it. Our structure here is basically layering the support of Wyoming and the commission on top of the support that we did. So we set out, even without Wyoming's support here, in states where we're operating, we will backstop that guarantee for the operator in support of the bond that's required. So I think we could come up with a structure here that we could get them even better rate and no collateral for their bonds and make it quite affordable. Whereas currently, without some sort of support like this, and I truly believe that a private market support of this type structure will put the producers in a position where they could meet their regulations, because otherwise they're going to go out of business. And this whole concept about, this whole idea that higher surety requirements are going to put a financial strain or put certain operators out of business is true. We're seeing this across the United States in a variety of different jurisdictional venues. And I would commend Wyoming for being supportive of its industry. And I think that this is a brilliant solution. I would love to participate as One Nexus, but I think that a private market solution participating in conjunction with the commission here will achieve the goal of getting the producers in Wyoming who are operating on federal lands access to affordable surety bonds. So next slide, please. And then I'm going to really just open it up to questions, because I've covered a lot of this. The benefits of partnering with One Nexus or a private solution here is reduced financial burden to meet the BLM compliance requirements. We can support and do support the administrative process and the administrative requirements of administering a program like this. So we'll make it easy. We could customize our contract terms. We do this all the time. We have done this exact same structure in private market situations. I'll talk about Conoco and EOG. When they sold assets to smaller operators, they required bonds. The operators had difficulty in getting those bonds, so they came to us and said, can we enter into a One Nexus solution and go to Conoco to see if they would apply? So I'll just put that out there. And we got through that process. We went through their risk managers, and they said, we actually like this because instead of the money leaving the system to go pay a surety bond carrier, surety bonds are not meant to pay. Our structure is meant to pay. We know that every single one of these wells, back to the life insurance analogy, every single one of these wells will have an end of its life, just like all of us will. So we have structured this to pay. And we could administer that. We provide a fixed preferred annual rate. Surety bonds are subject to repricing every year, so you might be paying 2% this year, but have to go pay 3% next year. On top of that, they can require and call for collateral at any given time. If you've never read an indemnification agreement by a surety carrier, please do so. It'll make your stomach turn. I'm an operator. I've been an operator. I've read those, and it's scary. They're not really friendly to the operator. So we don't call for more collateral. And I think we could get to a structure here that is being proposed by the commission in this working group to require no collateral. Because I think that if we can work with the bonding company, and we are working with some bonding companies, by the way, I don't want to make it seem like they're the enemy here. We are working with some bonding companies to do this exact type structure. And I think if we layer the sovereign support of Wyoming on top of One Nexus here in our private market solution, we could get them a preferred rate with no collateral. And then it is transferable. These contracts are written to make it easy to transfer your wells. So if I'm an operator here, Mr. Van Cleef is an operator, he sells some wells to me, this contract could transfer. So the monies that have been paid in will continue to benefit the state and continue to benefit the new operator, as well as protect the predecessor operator here. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions. I really appreciate everybody's time, and I'm grateful for the opportunity here to present our company.
Okay, questions for our panel. Representative Conrad, then Tarver.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Sanchez, thank you sincerely. That was very, very good. My question in your latter example, if a gentleman sells you a new well, or sells the well, does he receive any money back? Or are those sunk costs that he will never receive back on the years he's paid into the fund, or in this case, One Nexus?
So,
Mr. Sanchez.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Representative, the answer is specific to Wyoming. It depends on whatever the statute, how we want to write the contract. So typically, when there is a third-party obligee involved, it would require release from that third-party obligee. So in this particular case, it would require the BLM to say, Mr. Van Cleef's company is off the hook because the new company has provided substitute financial assurance. And in that particular case, the answer is yes. Mr. Van Cleef would receive monies back for the monies, basically a reimbursement of what he's paid in. We've done these contracts where it's just bilateral. We have some clients that have entered into these contracts to pre-fund their plugging liability in cases where they have working interest partners. So they want to start paying for this liability and start collecting for these types of obligations early. Those are very simple, they're cancelable, and they do get monies back, just like you would under a life insurance policy. Now, when that life insurance policy is pledged to somebody else, which is what we're talking about here, that contract will be pledged to the benefit of the support of the surety carrier who has issued the bond to meet the compliance needs of the BLM. So then the contract that we would enter into would basically say, if there's a new owner of that well, and that new owner has provided new financial assurance, then yes, it is redeemable and the monies are available to go back. Or Mr. Van Cleef may just decide to charge more for that well because he has already paid into this fund in support of that well's compliance needs, and he may actually get more for the sale. So the simple answer, I realize this has gone on for a while, but the simple answer is we could do both, and it's set up basically to do both. And the way I like to describe it is it's really up to whatever the highest value outcome for the producer may be. Yes, sir.
Follow up. Yeah, okay. Representative Tarver and then Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Sanchez, this is a fascinating concept. You're really going to throw a hardball here towards the federal government. How are they going to get us shut down if you keep coming up with solutions like this? So I guess to my question, would there be a way to tie these to the wells? Because, you know, obviously the wells are worthless at some point and they're just a liability. So could you tie it to the wells, somehow work with the state, tie it to the wells from birth to, death? And like Mr. Van Cleef, when they get to a point where, a barrel a day well basically has no you can't sell it at that point, but it still has value if this is tied to it. Is that a concept you're looking at, or is this all up in the air? We can do whatever we want.
Mr. Sanchez?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Representative Tarver, yes. I would say, I would think that you were there when we were designing this product. That's exactly what we designed for. There's a schedule in the asset retirement agreement itself that lists the individual APIs of the wells. We could even list and do list sections of gathering systems. We could assign value to the remediation of the surface facility and the pad and that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily just the well itself, but the answer is yes to the well and yes to other things around that well that require remediation expenses. And it is transferable. Now, when it's under a blanket, like what we're talking about here, what we're talking about here really is a blanket type coverage where an operator has to post $500,000 of coverage, whether they own 8 wells or 15 wells, but we could still allocate. So if an operator sells half of their wells, then we could split the contract. But we would have to do it within the rules of whatever the commission comes up with. But that would be very easy for us. We have people in-house, have partners that study each and will work with the commission to craft the contract to meet the blanket part of the requirement, but also facilitate the assignment to individual wells. What you pointed out was really at the nexus of when we created this product. I've mentioned that I've been an operator before. I have been involved with purchasing wells. and they were old end-of-life wells that we wanted to get a little bit more oil and gas out of. And in some cases were successful, in other cases weren't, and had to go to plugging. And I said, I wish this well had some money attached to it to help fund the plugging costs at that time. One way we like to describe this is to think about each well as having a small bag of cash attached to it. And as it gets traded on down the line, eventually somebody's going to sit there and say, gosh, you know, this well might cost $50,000 to plug, but there's a bag here of cash that might fund $30,000 or $20,000, so it takes some of the sting away. Or the whole 50, just depending on how much coverage was bought. But yes, that's exactly what we've designed this product to meet.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Ober.
can I just say, Representative Tarver, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not to put words in Mr. Sanchez's mouth here, but I think the shorthand way to think about it is, and what's really novel about this approach, is it really is life insurance for a specific well, all the wells, but each specific one too. So like you have life insurance for yourself, the well has life insurance for itself. So the concept is not that it's going to insure Oil Mountain, it's insuring Oil Mountain's wells. So that whatever Mr. Van Cleef does, the wells are the ones that are backed individually, not the company specifically. Does that make sense?
Okay, follow up? Are you good? Okay. Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sanchez, One Nexus, how long, I'm just going to combine these questions. One Nexus, how long has that company been in operation? What other states are you working in right now? And you mentioned the insurance company, but that you're funneling all this through, it's under the Oklahoma Insurance Department ultimately. But I didn't quite catch what that company was. Could you give me those three, please?
Mr. Sanchez?
Yes, sir, Mr. Co-Chair, thank you. We've been around, and I skipped over that slide, excuse me. Slide number, where is it? Number 6. We were founded in 2021, so we're in our 4th year of operation. We are a team of oil and gas industry professionals, petroleum engineers, finance people, drillers and such, insurance professionals that have insured oil and gas companies, and actuaries and things like that. So we have been working in a number of states, and I believe they might be listed here, but we're working with the federal government offshore. We're working in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Wyoming. I expect to be before the ECMC in Colorado soon. We're working with the Attorney General's office in Colorado through some of the contracts that I think we'll eventually be working on with this team here. California, we've been notionally approved for as an alternative form of financial assurance in California. So I've been before the regulators there as well. West Virginia, Pennsylvania, let me think. I mentioned Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. So we're really, our team has spread out. We have been involved with, and we've been meeting with the working group. Mr. Obermueller met with one of my partners a week or two ago now. And we're also now working with the infrastructure that supports the oil and gas operators themselves, namely the risk professionals like the insurance brokers, to help meet some of these requirements as they come up throughout the state. So we've really had a lot of traction. We started underwriting last year, though we were formed in 2021. We developed this concept early. During COVID, we sat around tables like this and started brainstorming and said, there's got to be a better way to do this. We saw what was happening and that the requirements for oil and gas operators were tightening, and it was becoming more difficult to operate. And I operate in Texas, and it was becoming more difficult to operate there. So we identified the problem, and then it took us about a year to design the solution, which ultimately we came on. We need a solution that will be around here long beyond our own lives. And it also had to meet some of the strictures of the concepts of security and permanency. And so ultimately, we just ended up with an insurance company. You asked about the insurance company itself. It's called One Nexus Oklahoma Captive Corp. We're domiciled in Oklahoma. The reason we're domiciled in Oklahoma is because Oklahoma insurance statute is quite progressive in terms of it providing for the ability to form segregated incorporated cells. So essentially what we could do in Oklahoma that we can't do in Texas, and I don't think we could do here in Wyoming, is we could form almost like a mini insurance company specifically for these contracts in Wyoming. It's very easy to do. It's an incorporated, we could form a Wyoming incorporated protected cell that is legally ring fenced under that statute. Oklahoma itself is an industry, oil and gas industry friendly venue, and it's also an insurance, progressive insurance venue as well. So we formed that insurance company there. Like I said earlier, it's backed by Munich Re, and it's independently managed. And so this is an important nuance that I think I'd like to just put out there. While we manage it day to day, one of the permanency questions for this is answered by the fact that our insurance company has independent auditors, independent technical managers that are in charge of working with our auditors and our actuaries to produce the reports that are delivered to the Oklahoma Insurance Department annually. So the way this is set up is my team and I could go away, and this insurance company will function in accordance with the contracts that it has entered into without missing a beat. I really wanted to set this up to outlast me. I'm 50 years old. I think that oil and gas, in spite of what the feds or whichever particular group is speaking at that time, I think oil and gas is critical to the future of this country. You acknowledged it here today. The employment in Wyoming, the employment in Texas as well is the same. I mean, we are oil and gas producing states. We rely on that revenue, and it's good and hardworking people that are getting up every day and working those wells. I grew up working as a gauger in South Texas, so I didn't get the nice, Rockies July and August weather. I was out gauging wells in South Texas, mesquite brush country, and I love this industry, and I think it's going to be around forever. And so we had to come up with a structure that would meet that, and that's why we ended up in Oklahoma, and we think that this is the best structure by which to achieve those goals.
Thank you. Other questions? Other questions? Oh, okay, Representative Lawley, question?
A comment as a member of the working group on.
Okay.
Okay, all right, thank you. You might famously remember that I asked to be on this working group. I was outed by Chairman Burkhart for passing a note. But one of the reasons is that in my previous life as an attorney in Texas, I represented the small insurance companies with the Texas Insurance Commission, and was very interested in this topic, and I had to learn it doing that about the difference between these different instruments like surety and life insurance. And I had even asked, I think Senator Rothfuss will remember at the very beginning, I sent an email. It's kind of like passing the note. I sent him an email saying, I think it would be good for the committee to have come together with a little bit of a working knowledge of the difference between a surety and insurance company. I'd never heard of this company. I never had an idea like this, but each of these instruments have limitations. And so I'll just say that for me, this was brilliant to hear this solution. We talked about wanting something out of the box, and I like it as a conservative that it is a private industry solution. So whatever we do with these bills, the private industry was working hard to come up with a solution because there were limitations in a bond. I really loved what you said about surety bonds, and they're actually not meant to be used, but they're not built consumer friendly either. And so I just really would just say that combining these two is a very unique out-of-the-box solution that to me personally is exciting. And I just, again, whatever we do, with it, I think that's important to recognize. And I'll say this, I was really glad I sent that note, because this is some of the most consequential work I've done since I've been on the Minerals Committee. I feel like, I mean, we've done a lot of good things. I'm not putting that down, but this is consequential. And we had a good group of people, stakeholders, legislators, to work through this and stick with it for 4 2-hour meetings. So I really appreciate the honor of being on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sanchez, as you write these contracts or life insurance policies for a particular well, you assume the life of the well being X, say 20, 30 years. But sometimes a well fails catastrophically early on in its life. It may just be a few years into this. And so you've started collecting premiums based on this longer life. But what happens if it fails prematurely and it has to be plugged and you haven't collected enough premiums to cover that plugging cost?
Mr. Sanchez?
Thank you. Yes, Representative Heiner, thank you. That's a good question. I'll speak in general terms, and I'll speak specific to what's being contemplated here. Excuse me. Essentially, the risk that you just described is called the duration risk of the well. We have actuaries, we do exactly as you described. We've built models and life tables for every producing well in the United States. So we have an expected life for every well, and we have an expected life for every group of wells. So typically the way we work with an operator is we ingest their data, and primarily data around their wells, and we run our actuarial models that say, we think that the expected life of this company's wells is on average 20 years. If it turns out that that 20 years doesn't come to pass and most of those wells go offline in 10 years, that risk is on us. So this is how I think we dovetail with the question at hand here that we're talking about that this working group has been contemplating and working with the commission, is to say One Nexus will take that duration risk. What I love about this structure that's being contemplated here is that the credit risk, because of the funding support by Wyoming, the credit risk essentially stays with Wyoming, and the duration risk is shifted to One Nexus. So that's a key distinction as to, I'm sure you're going to ask, the question has been asked, why don't we just do this ourselves? And the reason is, there's several reasons. Administrative, we could do it. This is what we're set up to do. I think we could do a very good job of this. But the risk associated reason is that under our structure, that duration risk that you just described shifts to One Nexus. That's why we are an insurance company. In order to act as an insurance company, or work as an insurance company, be treated as an insurance company under insurance company statute, there has to be a transfer of risk to the insurance company. So the risk that you just described is the primary risk that gets transferred to One Nexus. So if we go sign up 400 of your operators in the state, and operator, number 5 has wells that are expected to last 20 years, and something catastrophic happens, could be oil price collapse, could be massive change in regulation, it could be that there's a new form of nuclear energy that comes up and we don't need oil and gas anymore, something like that. Whatever it may be, maybe all those wells fail because there's an earthquake or some seismic shift. If that operator goes out of business and the BLM calls on the bond, we fund. One Nexus pays the $500,000. That then leads to, well, what is the support of Wyoming providing? Well, the support of Wyoming is going to provide that the payments for the contract are met. So when I mentioned credit stays with Wyoming, and Wyoming supports this, duration risk shifts to One Nexus, and One Nexus will support that. So as long as the operators are paying in, so if you think about this without the sovereign support of the state, we would then have to look at the balance sheet of that operator and say, how much cash do you have? Let me see your financial statements. They got to be audited. What are your other assets? What are your reserves worth? And then we would say, you're a small operator. We need a down payment. And we have to adjust our pricing accordingly. With the support of Wyoming, that doesn't matter anymore. We know that we're going to get paid. And so we don't have to ask for collateral, and we could set a really low rate, and then we would go to the surety company and say, not only are you being supported by One Nexus, which is then supported by Munich Re. But on top of that, we're layering the sovereign support of the state of Wyoming on top of that. It's as good as gold. So we want the lowest rate and no collateral for these operators here. And we'll get that. Now, if something comes to pass in your example that's catastrophic and that bond gets called early, that's where we fund. And the reason we like the structure is because it's pooled.
Follow up?
Mr. Chairman.
Follow-up.
So, Mr. Sanchez, the risk and liability doesn't end at plugging. An operator carries that risk forever. And there's some wells that get plugged that eventually develop a leak or some complications that have to be remediated. So at that point, if some well that's been plugged and, 10, 15, 20 years later has to be remediated or fixed or repaired, is that upon you, or do you try to find the operator? How does
No,
that-
sir, that's upon us, so long as that bond is outstanding. I'm sorry.
Through the chair, please. That's just our procedure.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I get a little excited sometimes about this. Yes, sir, that risk is on us. As long as that bond is outstanding and in place, that risk remains with One Nexus.
So Representative
Chairman?
Representative Knapp, I think?
Can I just? I
Yes,
just wanna-
Mr. Obermiller, go ahead if you want to continue to
Sort of,
answer.
yeah, just very important in that discussion that we didn't cover is we're talking about what Wyoming's backing is. I want to be clear about what the bills do there. What exactly is Wyoming's backing? All of that backing comes from industry. It's not from any other source. So the parts in the bill that Mr. Fuller described are either some small portion of a mill, and remember, it's voluntary, so people have to come in and be willing to pay that. That would help to start provide that backing, or it's funds that Mr. Kropatch, Supervisor Kropatch already has that the bill frees up for him to use for these purposes. So when we talk about Wyoming backing it, we're talking about industry backing it, not another source.
I think. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Senator.
And I just wanted to emphasize that was an important conversation that we had. We need to make sure that we're compliant with our constitutional obligations under 16.6, 16.1, and elsewhere. So that underlies all that we discussed, is the fact that these are funds that are coming from industry, either on a voluntary or through the conservation fund, and are therefore constitutionally compliant. So I appreciate Mr. Obermiller stressing that, because it is something we spend a lot of time talking about.
Thank you,
And
Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, one more, this is such a critical part
Mr.
of it.
Obermüller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, I'm so sorry.
Representative Knapp, we'll get to you someday.
You're giving me the look, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much. I think, so this is important that it's industry backed, but then the question might be, I think, from the constituents you're hearing from in your neck of the woods is, well, why would the operator want to choose paying an additional mill and paying a premium to this? Well, why would they voluntarily choose to do that? And the answer is shifting the burden from upfront capital expenditure that's locked away from being in the system, as Mr. Sanchez described, to an annual operating cost, a cost of doing business, that then attaches that bag of money to the well. So then you've freed up all of that capital as a small business owner, and you've transferred it to just an annual operating cost. And P.S., if the state is behind it, then that premium is, the state, meaning industry itself, is behind it, then the premium is even smaller.
Representative Knapp, and I'll make that the last question because we still need to have public input on this, plus discuss the bill.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Representative.
Like Representative Lawley talked about, this is probably one of the most important issues that we've seen come before us. I'm thankful for the subcommittee and thank you for your work. My question deals with the premiums, because with any other insurance, liability insurance as business owners, we've seen those increase dramatically over the last several years. So as far as the bonds go, with that type of insurance, how often do you review those? How often do premiums change, and what do you see over time with wells?
Mr. Sanchez, Mr. Obermuller, either of you?
Yes, thank you, Representative Knapp. The premiums under our proposal would not change, and they're fixed. That's one of the bullet points on one of these slides here. That's a key distinction between us and surety itself. And essentially, we work with the surety carrier because these are BLM bonds. There's no getting away from surety bonds. We're going to need them. And our contract with the surety carrier will be, the premiums are fixed, which is very different than it works now. If an operator were to go direct, they're subject to changing, reprice premiums every year and collateral calls. And we take both of those off the table.
Okay, thank you. So with that, if you four would hang with us, please, but I'm going to open it for public comment. Anyone in the room wish to comment on either of these two bills? Okay, anyone online? Okay, one last chance. Okay.
Vicki, if you'll just turn on your camera and your microphone, and you can go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, if you would identify yourself, please.
Thank you. Good morning, chairmans and committee. My name is Vicki Kissick with Kissick Resources from Gillette. And I apologize for not being able to be there in person. However, I am thankful to everyone that gets the Zoom in place. So thank you for that. I wanted to come forward this morning as a small business owner out of Campbell County. We do own and operate small stripper wells, and we were quite concerned when we heard about the bonding increase. My husband Clark and I own 2 federal wells, which this would affect. And currently our bonding is $25,000. And as you all know, it would go up to $500,000 if if this is implemented the way it is. So we just wanted to speak to the committee this morning as real people. My husband's actually out in the field right now, checking the wells, and real people who are small oil operators that this will affect detrimentally. I've listened to most of the meeting this morning. I apologize, I did not hear it all. I did hear the last portion of the presentation, and honestly, you all are represented to have a representation of your electorate and also a deeper understanding of many issues than what we have. So I appreciate Representative Tarver and Representative Knapp being there to get all the information and bring it home to us. However, I really would like to know, and I don't know if this is a public comment where you'll actually respond to my questions or if it just, is duly noted, but I'd really like to know in numbers when we talk about having this insurance company in place. For an operator such as ours, it's one of our federal wells is only, we get 1 load a year out of it. I mean, it is a very small well. And so we talk about $14,000-ish, depending on the price of oil. Let's talk specifics. With an insurance company helping us out that way in the state of Wyoming, what does that cost look like? Because what I'm fearful of is that we don't have like hard numbers, and maybe you gave hard numbers, but let's talk hard numbers on a well like that. Will we look back and say, well, we only had 2 federal wells. We should have possibly bonded them independently. We would have been 150,000. Maybe that was a better deal for us. I mean, I'm just curious on the crunching of the numbers. Did I miss that in the presentation, or can we have that so that we know we're actually getting a better result than what is presented to us now?
Ms. Kissick, that question would be better taken up after we make some decisions on the 2 bills. We're not in the position of being able to answer individual questions on individual wells. So do you have a comment, a feeling whether you like or oppose the proposed legislation?
I am thankful, and I do like that there is proposed legislation instead of just accepting what the BLM has brought to us, because frankly, they're overreaching, as I'm sure you've heard a lot in Clark and I's opinion. They're making it very hard to produce. I do support the current legislation that you've brought forward, and I look forward to it coming, more discussion with it. However, I do not want it to be passed without having hard numbers crunched, because passing something and then reading it later has never worked well for us.
Okay, thank you. And
Mr. Chairman.
I will rely on Representative Tarver and Representative Knapp to continue the conversation with you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, is there a?
Yeah, just real briefly, number one, as the bills are written, it's voluntary. But number two, just to Ms. Kissick, I will follow up with Ms. Kissick after this meeting and talk about that further.
Okay. Ms. Kissick, did you hear that?
Yes, sir. And thank you very much, Pete.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Anyone else online? Okay, anyone else in the room? Last chance. Okay, public testimony is closed. So committee, with the 2 bills, and I think I'll let the working committee kind of take the lead on this. What's your preference on the 2 bills? You've given it a lot of work, a lot of thought. So Senator Rothfuss, like, as I said, we will not vote on these because we need to resolve the 2 bill question, combine them into one, make one bill. We can't have 2 competing bills, and this is an important matter. So Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we had a meeting after these 2 bills were drafted and talked about some of the concepts of how to combine the 2 bills into one bill, and some of the changes based on discussion. One, for example, the bills as structured would focus on federal lands for some period of time in the beginning. We're pretty sure that the final structure won't have to do that. So we would allow opportunity for all lands to be potentially eligible for the program right off the bat, and maybe give some flexibility to OGCC to phase that in if they choose to, but have the opportunity to do it all at once. And some other concepts came into that discussion. But the point that we ended on was the idea that bringing the 2 together, the second bill, 141, has a better fleshed out private sector component than 92, but 92 provides a vehicle where if we don't have a private sector solution available, then we can do it internally. And it seems that we would want all options available to OGCC because we have 22 months and we can't fail. So the intent would then be, let's explore the private solutions first. That's going to be our priority, but we're going to have the internal backstop to ensure that we have the capacity to solve the problem regardless of whether we have a private solution available. But we really appreciate certainly understanding these private solutions better. The flexibility and opportunities they provide seem to really strengthen what we were intending originally. And as we heard through testimony, there's a lot more nuance that can be brought to the table through a more sophisticated approach than what we'll have through the OGCC unless we just hired an additional staff to do actuarial work, which I don't think anybody wants to do that, Tom least of all. So the nexus of the 2 concepts seems to be the ideal outcome, and I defer and invite my colleagues on the working group to weigh in.
Senator Rothfuss, though, I've read recently that actuarials are in high demand. So, So Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Senator Rothfuss did a great job of our concepts of pulling it together, and I just want to reiterate that my view is that the public or the private option is the first choice, and then secondarily the government, because again, we are not uniquely qualified to do this work well. And so part of it we could, and we could possibly create that, but that's not the preferred way for me to do. And I think we are in agreement about that, but I just wanted to emphasize that we would really, the backstop option would be something being done by the state, particularly in lieu of the short time period, but the private option being what we really are going to start with if possible. And then, so I think that's what I just wanted to add, that for clarity for the committee, that I think we were clear on that point. So if anyone has a different view on that, that might be something they might want to speak into. But again, I think combining that's going to be relatively easy with this concept. We went in enough detail to be able to do that in a way that, and again, there's also, that would cause, for example, some language. One of the bills, the second bill has the word shall in it. We're going to need to somehow create the language to show that that's the preferred option, but not the only, that shall will not be the right word there. So that's not difficult to do that, I don't believe. And so, and then he mentioned the language of if we go with the public or the private option first, there would really no reason to just limit it to the federal wells. This should be something that's all the state wells are have producers on state wells. This could help them on state lands, wells on state lands. So we have no reason to sort of phase in. So that was another thing we talked about, I think you mentioned. So again, those were my comments. Thanks.
Other comments, thoughts from the committee? Representative Tarver.
Mr. Chairman, it kind of looks like maybe the working group should continue to work these bills, and we look at a more refined bill in October, perhaps. And I'm certainly all for the private, if we can.
Okay, thank you, Representative, and I think that's the intention. We're just looking at giving the working group some direction of what the whole committee thinks, and right now, I think I can summarize that. It seems like there is a positive feeling towards including all wells, not just federal. Am I correct? Just wave your hand, nod your head, do something. Okay, thanks. All right. Okay. So, Brian, you have that one? Okay. The other one would be to put all options on the table with a private option coming first. Again, am I reading the committee correctly? Okay. And then combine all of that into draft 92 and drop draft 141. Okay. And Representative Knapp, you had some comments, please.
Mr. Chairman, I just have one question, and it's concerning the bonding pool itself, the account. I can see this actually being used in other industries, for instance, coal for the reuse of facilities and other minerals throughout the state. And I'm wondering if the language just concerning the bonding pool itself could be more general to not just isolate it to one mineral or one industry.
Okay. So Representative, the bills, and again, we have our single subject rule is oil and gas bonding. If we wish to proceed further with that concept of looking at other industries, I think we can do that, but not really germane to this bill. And I think that's a good option to keep in hand. We changed the bonding requirements a few years ago on minerals, other minerals, to allow them to put aside a bonding pool. But at that time, we had never considered any sort of private process such as this. But I think that's something to consider. I don't know that we'd have enough time in this interim to put that together. Kind of hate bringing forward a bill at the last committee that we haven't really vetted well. So not that I dislike the idea, I think it is a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just regarding the pool itself, just to not have limiting language, I think would be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just remind members, the inspiration for this legislation in the beginning was the work that we did 5-ish years ago on coal reclamation, where we provided an opportunity for our coal mines, and it was maybe less than 5 years, to invest, put their funds in a trust instead of towards surety. So they have that opportunity right now, only coal mines. So we don't have that for any other non-coal mining. And that's a big vacancy where we could take that legislation, not this year, probably next year. We could take that legislation and mirror it and maybe use some more advanced techniques that we're learning about at this point in time to provide that flexibility. But for our coal mining operations, they have a certain amount of total required surety, and that can then be offset by funding that they voluntarily put in a similar fashion, where it effectively becomes an asset associated with the mine itself, in trust, held by the state of Wyoming, reinvested, and that's available. And then once that is full, so to speak, their bonding obligation is entirely satisfied. They don't have to hold any more bonds because they have effectively a cash asset equal to the liability for reclamation in place. That was the inspiration. That was the first bill draft on this concept. The duration risk type concepts that are more unique here kind of made it not work for oil and gas, but it seems to work well for coal and might work well, or some hybrid, for our non-coal minerals outside of oil and gas, where the oil and gas well experience, I think, is a little bit unique here in terms of how the reclamation bonding works, how the transfers work, and I think this is a good solution well suited for it.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. I agree, that was probably the original inspiration, but I would say that it was Mr. Hinckley's passion in Laramie that brought us back to the table to do this. I commend the working group. Mr. Co-Chair, do you want this as a motion? You just want to do directive, bring it back in October, and let's get this done and get it taken care of?
I would do, Mr. Co-Chair, I'd do as a directive. I don't think we need a motion on this. We're still working it, and I think that's a good approach. Let the working group continue. But I would ask the working group, at some point when you feel you have a good document, circulate it among the committee so that when we show up at the next meeting in October, all we're looking at is potential for minor amendments, minor adjustments. October will be another full meeting, as you figured out from yesterday. So, and Representative Knapp, your concept, I would say keep that in mind. That's a good project for next interim.
Just a quick follow-up.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up, and then appreciate, we've got an opportunity here to definitely help our small producers. Estimated 400 is what I heard. In their studies, the working group, maybe get some projections on how many will pick up and run with this. We have an opportunity here we don't want to miss.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Another comment, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to give a shout out to LSO. They have worked with all of us in all these working groups, and there's been a lot you've already seen of working groups going on. And Brian in particular has done a stellar job. And this committee had a lot to go through, and he would produce drafts for us that were clearly on point. He understood what we were trying to do, and that was with all the working groups I was in, but that's often unseen. And when we had so many working groups going on, and Brian, had to be for everyone to do the work, I just want to shout that out, because it's an important part of our getting this work done.
Very, very good point. Yeah. Okay, so that concludes the discussion on oil and gas bonding. We're a few minutes ahead, so if you need to, let's take a 5-minute break. And Representative Larson, thank you for being able to join us. I hope everything went well yesterday. Okay, good to have you join us. Okay, 5 minutes. So we'll get back to work. I gave you an extra few minutes. So next thing on our agenda is oil and gas incentives for enhanced oil recovery. We have two bills and some preliminary information on those two bills. The one we've seen from last session did not make it through the Senate for some reasons, and then the other one was a backup bill to that, which did a little different with carbon dioxide. So with that, Brian, why don't you go through the two bills and then we can discuss them side by side, please.
So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'll start with 25 LSO 42, should have draft 0.5 carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery stimulus. This is 11-01 in the online meeting materials. This bill is based on 2024 Senate File 78. That bill did not pass the introductory vote and was a bill that this committee sponsored. This bill draft, which is identical to that version from last year, would provide stimulus payments to carbon dioxide providers who provide or sell captured carbon dioxide to oil and gas producers for use in enhanced oil and gas recovery. So starting on page 2, line 7, these are definitions for this new article. It defines authority as the energy authority. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology is technology with the principal purpose of capturing, reusing, storing, or sequestering, or using CO2 emissions to prevent CO2 from entering the atmosphere. Then a definition of carbon dioxide provider is a person that captures, generated, emitted, or produced carbon dioxide. Moving on to page 3 is a definition of enhanced oil and gas recovery, which means all existing and future technologies or methods to recover oil and gas beyond traditional primary and secondary methods. And then stimulus is defined as the stimulus created by this chapter. So moving on to page 3, line 13, any carbon dioxide provider may apply for and receive a stimulus under this article in accordance with all the following. So first, they must apply with the Energy Authority. And a carbon dioxide provider may request from the authority a pre-application determination of eligibility for the stimulus. Then on page 4, to qualify for the stimulus, the carbon dioxide must be captured by the provider through the use of CCUS technology. The provider must sell, deliver, or provide the captured carbon dioxide for use in enhanced oil and gas recovery projects in Wyoming. And the oil or gas produced from that recovery must be produced using that carbon dioxide. In page 4, line 16, the carbon dioxide provided must be from a source, a carbon dioxide source originating within the state of Wyoming. Page 4, line 22, the CCUS technology and the captured carbon dioxide that is used must qualify for the federal tax credit that's available under 26 USC 45Q. So the 45Q credit, that carbon dioxide must qualify for this. Page 5, line 7, the provider must not only qualify, but also must receive that credit before qualifying for the stimulus. Then page 5, line 12, to ensure that the enhanced recovery and the use of carbon dioxide satisfies the conditions of this stimulus, the authority may consult with any federal or state agency necessary before approving the stimulus. Then page 5, line 19, sets the amount of the stimulus at $10 for every 1 ton of carbon dioxide that is captured and is stored or used through the enhanced oil and gas recovery production. The stimulus is available until the date that the carbon dioxide provider no longer qualifies for the federal tax credit under 45Q. And then the stimulus must be paid from funds in the enhanced oil recovery stimulus account that's created in this bill draft, subject to available funds within the account. The stimulus cannot be paid from any other source except upon express approval. If there are insufficient funds for any particular fiscal year, the stimulus payments must be prorated. Then moving on to page 7, the Energy Authority administers the stimulus and is required to ensure that any provider seeking the stimulus qualifies under this article. There's also rulemaking authority for the authority. Page 7, line 9, upon determining eligibility, the authority reports that to the governor and the state auditor, and upon receiving a report, the auditor disperses the funds from the stimulus account to the carbon dioxide provider in the amount that's set in the bill. Page 7, line 19 is an annual reporting requirement for the Energy Authority to report to this committee. Then moving on to page 8, line 7 is the creation of the stimulus account. Funds in the account would be invested, earnings deposited in the account, and the funds are continuously appropriated to the governor for expenditure for the stimulus payments. Page 8, line 17, if there is no expenditure of any funds from that account before July 1, 2034, then all funds in the account revert to the LSRA on July 1, 2034. Page 9, line 1 requires the Department of Revenue to report to the governor, to the auditor, the Energy Authority, Joint Appropriations, and this committee on the amount of severance taxes that are remitted to the department as a result of crude oil and natural gas that's produced using enhanced oil and gas recovery techniques. Then, not later than September 1, 2025, and each September 1st thereafter, the auditor would transfer the amount of funds that are reported by the Department of Revenue from the general fund first to the Legislative Stabilization Reserve account. The reason that is happening is the initial appropriation is $10 million from that account. So once that $10 million is transferred, then the remainder would go into the stimulus account. Page 10, line 6 appropriates from the LSRA to this new account $10 million. It can only be used for the stimulus payments, and it would not revert except as otherwise provided in this act, which is that 2034 date, if no stimulus payments are made before that date. That's that bill draft, Mr. Chairman, and can answer questions or move on quickly to the next one.
Any questions on draft 42? Okay, go ahead and move to the next one then.
Yep. So, Mr. Chairman, 25 LSO 43, it's draft 0.4, enhanced oil recovery severance tax exemption. And this is 11-02 in your online materials. So this draft is based on 2024 House Bill 185, and instead of a stimulus, it would provide an exemption for the production of oil and gas produced through enhanced oil recovery techniques and using Wyoming carbon dioxide. A lot of the language in this bill draft is similar to the previous draft. The key difference is the mechanism that is used is as a severance tax exemption given to the oil and gas producer rather than a payment that is made to the carbon dioxide provider. So on page 2, lines 13 and 14, and again on 17 are just conforming amendments to reference the two provisions of the statutory severance tax. Then page 2, line 21 would establish the exemption, specifies that crude oil and natural gas production using enhanced oil and gas recovery techniques is exempt from 1/2 of the severance taxes under, and I'm on the top of page 3 now, 3914-204A3, so that's 1%, and then all of the severance taxes under A4, which is 2%, so a total of 3% severance tax exemption of the total 6% that is collected. The definitions that are on page 3 are identical to those that are used in the previous bill draft, so for CCUS technology and enhanced oil and gas recovery. Page 3, line 20, the taxpayer must apply for the exemption to the Department of Revenue. To qualify, it must be produced by means of enhanced oil and gas recovery from projects that use CCUS technology. The carbon dioxide captured and used in the recovery to produce oil or gas must be from a carbon dioxide source originating in Wyoming. The Department of Revenue may consult with the Public Service Commission, the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission before approving the exemption. Rulemaking authority, this is on page 4, line 18. The exemption is available to a taxpayer for all qualifying production that is completed before July 1st, 2032. So it's the sunset date on the exemption, and then an annual reporting requirement to Joint Appropriations in this committee on the use of the exemption and associated revenue impacts. With that, Mr. Chairman, I stand for questions.
Any questions on draft 43? Okay, all right. So a little bit more background. Last session, last interim, draft 42 passed this committee and went up for introduction on a budget session, failed introduction. What is now draft 43 was a backstop to that if that happened. The issue was, though, it did not come in time to even be introduced. So both bills, for lack of a better term, failed last session. So the bills are not mutually exclusive with each other. But if the committee prefers to go one direction or another, that's fine. If the committee prefers to take the same approach, which was to have one bill and to have the other as a backstop, I'm not sure how that would work because they're in some ways a little conflicting with each other. So that's the concept here with them. So Mr. Obermuller, do you have any comments on these two bills? You were intimately involved with both of them last session, last interim. I think staff adequately described what the two bills do.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, again, Pete Obermuller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. So starting with the first one, was it 42? Yeah, you described it correctly. So neither bill got debated on its merits in the session. They both failed for procedural reasons. Just at the outset, I would say I would prefer it if the committee advanced both of them and we can continue to discuss. They're trying to accomplish the same thing, I think, but in different ways. And so just to take us back for a second on the first one, because so much time has elapsed and so many important things have happened, the carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery stimulus bill, the idea behind that is to recognize that CO2 owners are those that are producing and capturing CO2, which it could be anybody who has that ability. It could be Trona, it could be a cement plant, it could be oil and gas, could be anybody, coal-fired utility. They're sitting on CO2 and they need to figure out what to do with it. And they're looking at the financial landscape. What they see right now is a federal tax code that heavily tilts in favor of permanent sequestration. Recall that the 45Q tax credit is $85 per ton for permanent sequestration and $60 per ton for enhanced oil recovery. So the idea was to say, in this bill, was for Wyoming to say, okay, look, we have all sorts of different opinions about whether or not we should capture CO2, whether we should sequester it, what in the world we should do, but the train has left the station in terms of what the federal government wants to do. So what can Wyoming do? Wyoming could, under this bill, theoretically step in and close that gap. And that doesn't, by closing that gap, that is not going to entice anyone who's not capturing CO2 now and doesn't want to. It's not going to entice them to do so. But if they do have CO2 they want to unload, they're at least looking at the landscape and saying, okay, from a tax perspective, I can now either do a deal with someone doing permanent sequestration, or I can do a deal with some operator in Wyoming who wants to do enhanced oil recovery. And for me, it's as the CO2 owner, it's going to be about the same. I remove the barrier to the productive use of CO2 in Wyoming. That's what the first one is about. So I wanted to say that because it's a little tricky, because everybody, as time elapses, people go back and look at this, they're saying, well, why wouldn't you just send the $10 to the EOR operator? And that could be done. You could, and perhaps I could get talked into it. I've had some conversations with some small operators who have suggested that, from EOR operators who have suggested that, and it's theoretically possible. But you still have the problem, if you were to do that, of the CO2 owner and the revenue they receive for unloading their CO2 in those two ways. So under the bill, essentially what it does is the small operator, Tarver Oil and Gas, knows that I own CO2 and that I'm getting a subsidy for it. And so Tarver Oil and Gas comes to me and says, you're getting subsidized, so I want preferential prices for CO2. That's under this bill. If you switch it the other way, then Representative Tarver is going to me and saying, I'm getting a subsidy, So in order to make you whole, CO2 owner, I've got to pay you more for CO2. The purpose behind the bill is to drive down the price of CO2, not artificially inflate it. So that's a critical part, is trying to put in some market forces to drive down the price of CO2. Okay? I like the bill. I would love for it to be debated on its merits. And so I'd ask the committee to move forward on that one. Happy to take questions on that one, and I'll move to the second one if you'd like.
Any questions for Mr. Obermuller on draft 0042? Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, one thing I'd like you to clarify for everybody here that on the 45Qs, that's not cash flow, that's tax credit. So that producer, in order to, he's going to be receiving some kind of value for his CO2 when he sells it. Plus, this is an incentive to further incentivize him, I guess, to actually sell the CO2 rather than store it. Without this incentive, he has a tax credit rather than cash flow. Is that correct?
Mr. Obermuller?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, you're exactly right. And you raise a good point that the bill is $10 per ton, but I mentioned that, of course, the tax credit differential is $25. So why only 10? Well, because in the EOR capacity, Tarver Oil and Gas is paying for that CO2. So then there's other expense reasons related to transportation and all that too, but you don't need to close $25 because of precisely what you've talked about. That the selling is the buying and selling is the cash flow part. The tax credit happens later, whether if you prove permanent sequestration or prove sequestration using EOR. Does that answer your question, Senator? Did I get close?
Follow up?
Yes, sir, I think it does, but I guess I'd like you to just discuss just a little bit what kind of return to the state on this $10. Is there an estimate on, and I know it's going to vary widely from field to field, but is there an estimate on what kind of return we would get either with the 43 bill or without, either way, as far as oil recovered?
Yeah, thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman.
Obermuller?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, I would have to call it up real quick to have the numbers. Maybe Mr. Whitman might have it in his large brain, just right off the top of his head. I don't know if he's going to speak or not. I don't want to talk for him, but there are, according to Mr. Whitman's report, there are 75 oil fields in Wyoming with over 10 million barrels of recoverable oil using CO2 injection. And as you recall from the committee meetings on this last year, the charts that Mr. Whitman put up about the incremental production increases after CO2 injection. That's sort of what's critical about this, is that we have lots of experience with CO2 injection in Wyoming for enhanced oil recovery. And every single one of them has been a success. And so we know that the revenue from it is significant. And that revenue comes back to backfill this program. So that, again, like we talked about in the previous bills, it is ultimately industry funded. In this case, the state fronts the early part of it, but the severance taxes come back. I can't put a dollar on it because I don't have the report open on my screen right now, but I can find it for you while we're sitting here.
Representative Heiner, and just before you go, if Mr. Obermuller, I believe if I remember that chart correctly, the return started at 5 years and then accelerated in the following years. Just
Mr. Chairman, that might be right. It might be 8 years. And it's important to know it's not immediate. It's not immediate.
okay. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, it's my understanding that our CO2 pipeline is at capacity or near capacity, and that may be the bottleneck right now. So are we incentivizing the wrong thing with this bill rather than we're looking at maybe the root problem is we don't have enough capacity to get the CO2 from the source to these oil fields where they can be utilized? Maybe we should look at some other avenue of incentivizing a pipeline, new pipeline or expansion.
Mr. Obermuller?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, you're exactly right. I would just say that I don't think that this is incentivizing the wrong thing. It's incentivizing a different thing. It's saying that, like I said, it's pushing back on the federal tilt towards permanent sequestration. You're exactly right that at least in Wyoming, CO2 is a commodity in great demand, as opposed to just a waste product that nationally we like to talk about it as. So when I talk to operators who could potentially do EOR projects, they're saying to me, yeah, it's hard, the investment I have to do for pipeline infrastructure and all that stuff is a barrier. And if there was something in place that I could go to my investors and say, here's an incentive that's in place for building this infrastructure, that would be enormously meaningful. That might be the second bill. But that's why the chairman said they're not mutually exclusive. This takes away that federal tilt to a certain degree, but you're not wrong that there's a different barrier to EOR that we should talk about.
Other questions? Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up, I guess dovetail with Representative Heiner, one of the challenges that we have, and to illustrate his comment, is that new projects are being trying to be constructed in the state of Wyoming. One of the questions, at least by the DEQ, is through the PSD application, what are you doing about capturing your carbon dioxide? And more importantly, how are you going to transport it or get it out of the area to EORI, et cetera, or other areas? The challenge I have is that obviously we're providing a stimulus or proposed stimulus here, but we're not doing anything to those other producers who are producing CO2 to get it from their location to your benefit. And now we have the DEQ asking questions of various producers. How are you going to do that? What is the cost to actually convey that CO2 to representatives like yourself? Well, we don't have an answer to that because there's no pipelines that exist, and these are the issues. So, and this isn't would you agree, but more importantly, it's just a comment to reinforce the necessity that as we look at one area for stimulus, we're really missing, as Representative Heiner had pointed out, the conveyance of such commodities to you for those recovery purposes.
Don't you agree?
I do agree, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. And Mr. Obermuller, I think we've had that conversation. I think we had that in May. So, yeah. Other questions on 0042? Okay, Mr. Obermuller, why don't you give us your thoughts on 43?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one thing I'd like to ask the committee to think about changing in that bill, but just conceptually, so this sort of turns, this is from a operational standpoint, a legislative standpoint, this is easier and cleaner. Politically, it may be harder in some ways. And quite frankly, you guys know me, it's difficult to release the death grip on oil and gas revenue in this state. So this is a straight exemption on revenue. The previous bill has no exemptions. It just invests severance taxes into the program. This is an exemption. I don't have a problem with that personally, and would argue in favor of it. But that's the difference, and the idea is to sort of switch it now again. Of course, if you're an EOR operator and you do a project based on the conditions in this bill, now you're receiving the severance tax credit roughly equivalent to the $10 in the previous bill. But now it's accruing to the EOR operator. So these are my members now, which is good, and I support that, of course. But then they know if they're going to, they need to still purchase, they've got to find CO2 somewhere, and with these and now they're getting the subsidy, and so the operator or the CO2 owner is saying, well, you're getting a subsidy, so here's my premium for our CO2 we own. So either way, I mean, you can attack it from either side. This is certainly easier to be, I mean, exemptions are easy for the Department of Revenue. Like that part's not going to be a problem. I would say, however, just functionally for the bill, if you go to line 5 or page 5, lines 1 and 2, this is the sunset. It's qualifying production by means of enhanced oil and gas recovery that is completed before July 1, 2032. Completed doesn't really work, Mr. Chairman, because of course, EOR projects are very long-term. So I think what you might be looking for is oil and gas recovery that has demonstrated increased incremental production by that date, or something of that. I'm open to other suggestions on that date, but completed just won't work because nothing will be completed by 2032. Does that make sense, Mr. Chairman? I don't
Yes,
have a
that
great
makes
suggestion
sense.
for you right now, unfortunately, but again, something in Mr. Whitman's big brain might be helpful.
Okay, questions on, okay, I'll do Representative Knapp first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So speaking of the sunset, because the impetus of this was the Q45 tax credit and the gap that exists there. If that tax credit goes away, would this also sunset with that?
Mr. Obermueller?
Mr. Chairman, so, yeah, don't confuse the two bills, Representative Knapp. So the first one, the one tied to 45Q, there's been some discomfort with tying it to a federal program, I think you're alluding to. But what that bill does, first of all, by tying it to 45Q, you clear all the hurdles of making sure you qualify, number one. But then if 45Q goes away, then that whole thing goes away on that bill. This bill has nothing to do with 45Q. 45Q is not involved in it at all. It's simply a 3% exemption on oil produced with enhanced oil recovery from a CO2 sourced from Wyoming. So whatever sunset you put in would be the sunset, and doesn't matter what happens with 45Q.
Okay, I believe Representative Heiner was next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's not often I get to go before ladies. Mr. Obermueller, I like this bill better because of the perceived constitutionality issues with the other bill. And as you mentioned, the benefit goes directly to those potential EOR producers, and I like that. With my experience in EOR, the 2032 date is going to be very difficult because it's very labor and capital intensive, and it takes 7 years just to get the project ready to start up, is normally what I've seen. So, this gives us very, very little time to get those projects in operation, especially if we have to build a new trunk line to transport the CO2. But my question is, with this bill, it is available to all qualifying production by means of EOR. So we have some fields that have been in, some EOR fields that have been in operation for decades now. Would this benefit those that have already come into operation and have expended that capital? Are we incentivizing the wrong people in this scenario, or should we just say new production that comes online in the future due to this incentive program?
Mr. Obermueller?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the question, and I'm thinking through it here on the fly. I mean, my answer as the head of the association is I would prefer favorable tax decisions by this body to apply to all of my members. So whether you make it new production or not, I guess is a policy decision, but I would prefer that it apply broadly.
Representative Heiner, I think I can answer that one because the draft 0042 was my personal bill from last session. The concept was everyone would benefit after the effective date of the bill. So I'm not trying to discriminate against those who've been doing EOR production, some of them for 40 years. If they continue following the bill, they would get the credit, but the idea is to incentivize new and more EOR, because we have millions of barrels of stranded assets, which right now we get no severance tax from. And 3% to me is way better than zero. So, but it's debatable for the committee. That was just the original concept I had.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Obermuller.
To your point, I think it is, I know this committee is smart about this stuff, but it is, I think it's important to remember that the reason why it's attached to enhanced oil recovery is that is where a significant amount of our new resource and new revenue is going to come from outside of the Powder River Basin that's producing new wells right now. So as Mr. Whitman's report points out, you can generally expect 10 to 15% of the oil in place to be recovered on initial production and the pressure from initial production. CO2 injection enhanced oil recovery has demonstrated to produce another 10 to 15% of the oil in place after that initial production. And we've had just, decades of proven success by doing that. So the trouble has been, we haven't had a new EOR project in a long time because of how capital intensive it is. So that's the idea, is to look at our existing fields and the potential there, which I think is somewhere in the 2 billion barrels range statewide, is to get at that 10 to 15% of that.
Mr. Obermuller, and I'll interrupt the committee for a minute here. Is it fair to say that at some point, all the production in the Powder River Basin, which has been tremendous for the state, but at some point they will reach a decline curve where it's either P&A the wells or go to enhanced oil recovery?
Mr. Chairman, it is fair to say that. It is, the PRB is exciting because there's 14 stacked formations, and we don't know either the vertical or horizontal bounds of the PRB right now, so it's an exciting exploratory field. But you're absolutely right. At some point, we're look towards EOR.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, I tend to like this second option better because we have systems already set up to do exemptions, to things like that, and it's not tied to a federal program. And it goes to these producers who can, am I right that under the bill, they get to make the decision of what they do with the benefit of the exemption. So if their issue is having to pay more for the CO2, then they can do that. Or if their issue relates, the greater issue is the infrastructure piece, and they need some capital invest in that, they have the ability to do that. And probably eventually 45Q is going to go away, and so, which would likely bring the cost of CO2 down as a commodity in Wyoming. But I feel like that has that kind of flexibility that the other one doesn't. Although I understand exactly what the other one's trying to do, and I actually have been for that bill, but when I look at this option, it seems to be better overall for producers. But am I right about that, or do you see that differently?
Mr. Obermuller, thank you, Representative Lawley, for finally getting to a question. Mr. Obermuller.
Mr. Chairman, maybe I'll finally get to an answer. I have a hard time answering, to be honest, Representative Lawley. In terms of immediate impact on EOR producers, particularly if it includes, companies using EOR now, there's an immediate financial benefit to operating in Wyoming, one of the highest cost operating areas in oil and gas states, as you know. So there's no doubt about that. And it's easier and cleaner, easier to start and do, and will have immediate impact on operators. There's just no doubt about that. So I absolutely support it. It doesn't do anything to deal with the fact that as a CO2 owner, it makes more sense for me to send CO2 to permanent sequestration than it does to send it to an EOR project. So we have multiple hurdles. We have the infrastructure hurdle, Representatives Conrad and Heiner pointed out. We have just the cost for an EOR producer hurdle, and we have the federal government's particular policy preference as well, that are all hurdles in this. And I think they all deserve some equal weight, to be honest.
Representative Knapp.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So that kind of goes back to my question because, again, typically when you have a tax exemption, it's with a purpose. And so with the purpose of this second bill still to be to cover that gap of the Q45 tax credit falling short, and without that, what would be the further purpose? Because it doesn't address infrastructure. It mostly addresses just a reduction of tax or an exemption of tax.
Mr. Obermuller.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Knapp, yeah, I mean, I think the intent of the purpose is a different way of going about closing that gap. But Representative Lawley is correct that an operator could use the capital they now have that they're not paying in severance for whatever reason. That could be reinvesting in their field or paying their employees or whatever they want to do with it. And then they still have to turn around and buy CO2. So do they, does that price stay the same? I doubt it. Government influence will change its behavior, as you know. Will that result in an artificial hike in CO2? Possibly, I don't know. Will they use it for purposes of like, now I have more resources to buy more CO2? I don't know. So there's just a little bit more. It's clean in the sense that it gives the operator the choice of what to do with it, and I support that. But the issue you highlighted is fair.
Senator Rothfuss, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. If we're in a supply constrained environment, which we're in right now, where in the future demand is going to exceed supply, and we provide an incentive that just increases demand without providing any change to supply, then, I mean, simple economics says price goes up. So second bill should lead to prices going up. If it works, if it does as it seems to intend to do, it should lead to a price increase. And, I don't know how that helps the state. I don't know how that helps the, I guess it would help the producers from that 3% side, but I don't know how perfectly elastic the market would end up being to compensate for that price. There might be gains, there might not be. The first bill just creates a balance and should lead to more supply. It's on the supply side and doesn't change the demand side at all. It would only, if successful, it would only increase supply. So that should lead to decreased cost, which is the intent of it, and actually lead to the same net outcome from the producer standpoint, where they end up having the compensation. That's, again, this was a task that we put to the university, recall last year, working with their economists, their energy economists. How do we accomplish this task in the context of an understanding of the state's energy economics, CO2 supply, and how 45Q influences that? They were tasked with coming back with a solution that would address that in a way that actually worked with the market in a favorable way, balanced the 45Q disincentive such that it became neutral. You could honestly even tack on another $1 or $2 and make it favorable. You would still be on supply side, and you would be helping lead to more local supply. And so I understand it's not an accident that the first draft is more complicated. It's more complicated because this is complicated. And so when you hand a bunch of PhD economists a problem, they're going to take all of this into consideration. They're not going to come up with a simple solution, regrettably. And so we end up with a complex bill. But I think we shouldn't let simplicity lead us to favor the second bill over the first, because the first bill does what it's supposed to do, which is provide a neutral market with regard to 45Q and increase the CO2 supply availability in the state of Wyoming for our producers, which leads to more production good. So I want the committee to understand the context that the two bills were drafted in, because I think it's important to go back to that historical consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Don't you agree?
Thank
Mr.
you, Mr.
Obermuller.
Chairman. Yeah. The senator is exactly right. The committee last year did task UW with looking at this because the committee wanted to know from some neutral source about putting hard numbers to it, and that's what they did. And that's what led to the EOR report on the fields and the potential barrel recovery and the matrix of how many years it would take to backfill the program with new severance tax dollars and all that stuff. That's all UW's work, not my work. So the senator is right about that.
Representative Lawley, a question?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the first bill, when 45Q goes away and the program goes away with it, which I think is a correct understanding, what happens to that money? What is it? Did the bill address then where the money goes? What do we do with it? If it's going to stop dead kind of tracks, so to speak?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Obermuller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Lawley, as Mr. Fuller pointed out, any unexpended money is reverted to the LISRA.
Okay, back to the LISRA, okay.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Seeing no other questions, I think we've beat both of these up. Any public comment on either bill? Draft 0042, draft 0043. In the room. Okay, anyone online? Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. If you'd identify yourself for the record, please.
Certainly. My name's Matt Sachet. I'm the administrator of the Mineral Tax Division of the Department of Revenue. And I just wanted to bring up something that has not been brought up before, and that is concerning number 43. Nobody has made mention that there is currently also a credit within the statute, 3914-205 subsection D is a CO2 credit that producers of oil that use tertiary production within or use CO2 within their tertiary production can take that credit. I just think it should be noted that there is a credit there, so that 43 would be an additional credit on top of what's already been there. I'll be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Any questions for Mr. Sachet? And Mr. Sachet, thank you for bringing that one up. That's one we completely forgot about. I do remember there is that credit. So for the committee's understanding. Any questions? Nope. Okay, thank you. Just hang with us. We know where you are. We may have you back. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Other public comment? Okay. Oh, do you have a question for Mr. Sachet?
For Mr. Obermuller.
Okay, go ahead and introduce them, and Senator Cooper, ask your question.
Mr. Obermuller, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, currently, the CO2 that's taken out of a natural gas stream, is it subject to severance tax?
Mr. Obermuller?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, are you talking about produced natural gas and then used and the separation of it? What I'm sorry, help me understand.
Yeah, the CO2, excuse me, Mr.
Senator?
The CO2 that's produced with the natural gas and then it's captured, for example, in the western part of the state here, is that CO2 stream considered part of the natural gas stream and taxed as such as it's sold, or is it strictly considered a waste product.
Mr. Obermuller?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, I don't believe, I will follow up with you, but I don't believe so. It is, the natural gas itself is taxed, not the CO2. That's my understanding, but I will follow up with you in case I'm wrong.
Okay,
If it's sold, of course, it's taxed, yeah, but not.
okay.
Not,
Mr.
but the severance is not this, it's not, there's not a separate severance tax that applies to CO2. It applies to the product.
I believe Mr. Sachet can answer that question.
probably.
Can you?
Mr. Chairman, yes, CO2 is taxed as part of the natural gas stream.
Okay. Okay. All right. That's why I had you hang with us, because we
Yes,
have the
sir.
questions. Okay. So there was someone else online? Okay. So one last chance for anyone in the room. Comment on either bill? With that, I'll close public testimony. So, committee, let's take 42 first. What would you like to do with it?
Do you want motions now, or do you want to move them to next time, Mr. Chairman?
I think these bills, because we've seen them before,
Yeah.
this came out of the committee last time, we can take motions on these.
Okay, I'd move 42, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, moved by Rothfuss, seconded by Ellis. Okay, any further discussion on 42?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Since it is back before us, I had a concern that came to me after we passed it last time. On page 9, and this is just the accounting of the $10 million. So we establish an account that's a cash flow account of $10 million. It can't go below that. We draw upon it, we put back into it. The language related to it starts transfers from it based on revenue going into it. But you can't do that for a cash flow account and maintain cash flow over a long period of time, because we don't start paying it back for 8 years. So we draw down for effectively 8 years, and then we start putting back in. I think that we need to take out the D paragraph, recognizing that it's a long-term payback. It's not like the money's going to get spent or anything, it's just that it won't revert. Alternatively, we could say only reverts anything over $10 million. But you have to maintain a value of the cash flow account, and I'm worried about us going prematurely negative cash flow because of the length of production and the length of these projects. So that's very complicated, but what it comes down to, the simple amendment would honestly be strike the D paragraph, and it just effectively stays as a cash flow account until we legislate otherwise, or until the account is closed, and then it all transfers back to the LISRA once it's no longer in use. So
So Senator, that's a proposed amendment?
yes, I just trying to make sure everyone understands it. So that would be,
So-
Mr. Chairman, I move to amend by striking the D paragraph, including the Romanettes 1 and 2, bottom of page 9.
All right. Mr. Fuller,
Yeah,
please.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, if subsection D is deleted in the entirety, there is no cash flow into the new account. So it would only be drawn down. Mr. Chairman, based on Senator Rothfuss's comments, one option would be, I think as he said, you flip the order, so 2 becomes 1, and then anything over $10 million in a fiscal year would go into the LSRA until $10 million is transferred under that paragraph. And that may accomplish, I think, what Senator Rothfuss is looking for.
Mr. Chairman, sure, that does accomplish it, yes. And I think, yeah.
That's a
So
modification to your
That is the
amendment.
new amendment.
Okay, you're withdrawing the first one.
Having withdrawn the first one, amending it to the second, to flip that order so that we maintain the $10 million. That's going to work perfectly. I appreciate that, Mr. Fuller.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, seconded by Conrad. Any more discussion on that? Okay, committee, all in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Okay, the amendment carries. Okay, any other amendments? I'm not going to go through this page by page. Like I said, we've looked at this bill and worked this bill for a year and a half, so we should all be familiar with it.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to point out on page 5, line 4, there is a typo there. It says
Okay.
carbon oxide rather than dioxide.
Okay. Yes, I think that's
So-
merely a,
Just a typo.
just typo. We'll correct that. We don't need a motion.
Mr. Chairman, actually not a typo.
Oh, okay. Please, then,
Yep,
sorry.
yep, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, if you look at 26 USC 45Q, it refers to that federal tax credit as one for carbon oxide sequestration. So that term comes from 45Q itself.
Okay, we learned something.
So Senator Cooper, the feds got it wrong and we're just going to repeat it.
Sounds like government.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, any other amendments to 42? Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
Senator?
I do have an observation here. You know, the $10 million deal is a pretty big bite. Not huge, but something very doable. But the $10, consider where I went to school, but it looks to me like the severance tax on the CO2 for that ton of CO2 would be about $1.50. So we're getting a return on that $10 anyway. And I think that's a pretty good point. The other point I'd like to make is that enhanced coal recovery is going to continue whether we have the 45Q credits in place or not. And the 45Q credits are important, which, by the way, are a Trump-era program. That's not something new. And the return on our $10 million investment is in the range of $2 to $3 billion. So that's a pretty minimal risk compared to what our potential return is, I think. I'd just like to make that point.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other, yes?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, in response to a question that was asked previously about the reversion of these funds to the
Please.
LSRA, the only way they would, there's no mechanism for reversion unless no funds are spent by 2034. So after 45Q expires, the legislature would need to take some further action to revert those funds to a different account.
Okay. Anyone want to propose an amendment? Senator Rothfuss.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that we would need to, honestly. I feel like, again, taking a look at that, this is in theory a decade away. Having that account as a cash flow account and letting a future legislature manage it honestly makes more sense. There may not even be a LISR at that point in time, realistically. So I think it's appropriate for us to structure it as we have it structured.
Okay, all right. Any other comments? Sensing you're ready to vote. Question being called. Please, Heather, would you please call roll? We are voting on 25 LSO 0042, carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery stimulus.
Senator Cooper? Aye. Senator Ellis? Aye. Senator Jones? Aye. Senator Rothfuss? Aye. Representative Banks?
Aye.
Representative Conrad?
Aye.
Representative Heiner? Aye. Representative Knapp?
Aye.
Representative Larson?
Aye.
Representative Lawley?
Aye.
Representative Tarver? Aye. Representative Western? Excused?
Excused?
Co-Chairman Dockstetter?
Aye.
Chairman Burkhart?
Aye.
That passes.
Okay, so we have passed 25 LSO 0042, as amended. Okay, next bill then is 0043, which we've discussed. And again, as from the last session, this was a backup bill. They are not mutually exclusive, so we can address it individually without having to link it to the other bill. Any discussion on 42, I'm sorry. Okay, any amendments? I'm not going to go through it page by page. I think we've already had plenty of discussion on that. Okay, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just posing a question about, is this a good vehicle to address the issues of infrastructure needs and things that operators may have? Do we see it as that? If we did them both, is that kind of the thinking, or?
Yeah, Representative Lawley, I don't think we can address the infrastructure in this. It's merely a severance tax exemption. We would have to write a separate bill on the infrastructure. We kind of beat that conversation up in May on where we need to go with infrastructure, which was, if I remember correctly, the results of that conversation is to encourage looking at another, I forget what we called it, pipeline corridor initiative, especially up into the Bighorn Basin, and I think into the one field up near Gillette as the next two, to look for a pipeline corridor initiative in those areas, but we did not have legislation on it. This is, again, back to our single subject. We need to stick with that.
Yeah, I understood that, but I guess I'm thinking practically, what benefit, it's going to give these company operators additional money to use to incentivize them to keep doing what they're doing. Correct? Am I correct on that? And they can use that.
Representative Lawley, you're correct, but it's also to incentivize new EOR. And I think there are some places where, with this bill giving a 3% reduction in the severance tax, may be enough incentive to convince a company to run maybe a 10-mile pipeline into an abandoned field and produce it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering about. Thank you.
Okay. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would propose an amendment on bottom of page 4, top of page 5.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, just as a
Yes.
point of procedure, I'm not sure there was a motion on the
You're
bill itself
correct.
yet.
Oh, I move the bill.
Moved by Heiner, seconded by Lawley. Okay, now we're correct on our procedures. Thank you. So we're at the bottom of page 4, top of page 5.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would propose that we make this incentive available only for new projects, the new EOR projects, where it says for all qualifying production. I would like to insert, and LSO can have the correct verbiage for this, but only those new projects for the wedge production after the enactment of this bill.
Everyone clear on the amendment? Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, seconded by Conrad. Okay, everyone's clear. What that would do, the amendment does, is it applies only to new production, not existing production that may continue, but a new enhanced oil recovery production.
And Mr. Chairman, we have a few EOR fields that have been in operation, as you mentioned, for decades, and their large capital expenditures have largely been paid out by now. I don't see any reason to incentivize them. We want new production because there's a vast amount of production available with EOR, and we want to provide avenues to increase that. We haven't had a new EOR field in Wyoming for decades. And this is an avenue to provide some incentive to maybe get some of those moving forward in the future.
Okay?
Mr. Chairman, question on the amendment.
Senator.
So with this done, that would eliminate this sunset of July 32. It would just be ongoing for all new CO2 production?
I think that would be a favorable for this amendment, just to remove that, because EOR, as the good senator is aware, it takes a long time to get in place. You have to change everything to stainless. It takes a large amount of capital, and it has a vast amount of revenue potential for the state as these oil fields come back into life.
Is the second okay with that change?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, Representative, or I'm sorry, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to be a fan of this bill for the reasons that I kind of laid out a few minutes ago, but on the amendment, I have concerns with the amendment from, if we do pass this bill, from kind of an economic fairness standpoint. And I recognize that the desire to have the legislation result in new projects. I think that's good, that's appropriate. The concern I have from a fairness standpoint is you're effectively biasing the CO2 purchase market at that point in time, where you have existing operators that still need to purchase CO2 for stimulation. And those operators will be operating effectively at a disadvantage relative to anybody that comes into operation ahead of this. So we are skewing the marketplace at that point in time. We're doing what we don't like the feds to do. If we create, these people should be okay, these people shouldn't. So as opposed to what the other bill does, which is try to level something where we saw an effect, this creates a market skew. And I don't think that will honestly be taken well by our existing producers that have been innovative and been performing for a number of years. The ones that invested the capital probably won't appreciate market bias against them. But I also just think in general, it's going to be bad policy to create that inequity. So while I don't like the bill, I do think that we should, if we're going to pass it, and suspect I might be one of a small number of no votes if there are any others, I think we should pass it in a clean and appropriate way. So I don't think the amendment's a good choice.
Representative Heiner.
Thank you, and thank you, Chairman, and I respect the good comments of the senator. We routinely pass tax exemptions to bring industry into the state, sales tax exemptions and other avenues to provide economic development. What we want to do is provide economic development to the oil and gas facilities that we have a huge potential to bring new life into fields. And for the past number of decades, 20 years that I can think of, we haven't had any movement in EOR. This is an opportunity to create some movement there. And we realize with EOR, we can achieve another 30% of production from these fields that are basically idle or declining. So this is, to me, it's similar to a sales tax exemption that we provide for other industries. We've provided some severance tax exemptions in the past to other minerals and just gives an even playing field for our oil and gas.
Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Senator Rothfuss' comments, and I guess what I would ask is, how does limiting it to new production, when new production's included, more incentivize new production? In other words, if new production's here, it's incentivized. How does the fact that we would include already existing producers, to the extent they would qualify, change that? I don't see how this more greatly incentivizes new if we just make it for new. The incentive is there, and so if you could help me understand that, Representative Heiner.
Representative Heiner, do you have a comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the Representative Lawley. I appreciate the question. It's all about economics. For to convert a field to ER production, it's all about the economics, and severance taxes are a big portion of those economics. And Mr. Obermueller may be able to help us with this, but if there's a great deal of capital construction and the project economics are improved by reduced severance taxes, that will probably move that project forward.
Representative Lawley.
Thank you. That's really not the question I asked. I agree wholeheartedly with the incentivizing of new production. But I don't understand your point of how that incentive that's in the bill unamended grows greater because of the exclusion of already operating producers. It doesn't really change the incentive that we're giving for the new production people. Everybody, everyone that can qualify, but when you limit it to new, I understand you have a benefit, but it's no different than the benefit you have when you've included the other group as well. It doesn't diminish, the new producer's benefit is not diminished by the inclusion of the already existing operators, unless you can explain to me how.
And
Representative Heiner.
Mr. Chairman, we could probably take this offline, but incentive, to me, a definition of incentive is to create a motive for people to do something they ordinarily wouldn't do. So if a existing field is already producing, there's no reason for an incentive there because they're already in operation. Incentive is for those that would probably not do the additional expansion under current economic situations. The old fields that are already producing do not need a incentive.
Okay, other discussion? So I'll take some liberty here. One of the reasons that was in my original bill was to keep some of those older fields in operation. There is a decline curve. It's based on economics and that, and it may keep some of those old fields in production longer. That's all. So any other comments on the amendment? Okay, so amendment on page 4, line 21, extending over to page 5, lines 1 and 2. And I think that was your amendment. Am I correct, Representative? Okay, I just want to make sure. So we're deleting the cutoff date also. Okay. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Okay, show of hands, all in favor. 1, 2, 3, 4, all opposed. Okay, 3, 4, 5, okay. The amendment has failed. Any other amendments? Senator Cooper.
On page 5, the sunset date, I'd like to eliminate that.
Okay. Eliminate the sunset date. Staff, do you have that? And seconded by the co-chairman? Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that means effectively eliminating the entirety of Romanet 7. I guess I'd look to Brian to see. I think that's all it does. Okay, so just for clarity, for the movement, it would be eliminate the paragraph.
Okay. Senator Cooper, is that your intent?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's fine. I'm fine
So to
with
clarify it, you are starting on page 18, or page 4, line 18. No, I'm sorry, line 21. And extending all the way through line 2 on page 5. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, is that the second's understanding? Okay, discussion on that. Okay. Sensing no discussion, all in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
No? Okay, that amendment is adopted. Further discussion on the bill. Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. In addition to the previous comments, which I expressed my concern already, I would note that the interplay between 42 and 43, while they're not mutually exclusive, the economics interplay is important to realize that the 42 was structured based on the assumption that half of the severance would be coming back into the cash flow account to cover the cost of the $10 per ton for the 45Q. That's on the assumption of a full severance tax. So if you were to pass both of these, it's just important to realize there would not be enough cash flow coming back in, and the other bill would not then be a 3% gain it would effectively be a 0%, we'll say. And maybe it's even more complicated than that. It wouldn't work out the same. I'll just say that the math no longer works if you pass them both, so that either requires some sort of additional convergence between the two bills or a recognition that there's going to be a shortfall in the other bill. And I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that.
Thank you, Senator. And one thing, and I'll add to the senator's comment, it would be my thoughts that as these bills, if 43 passes, as they go forward, 43 is held in reserve, and you can't run these two bills in the same session. They would create problems, I think is what Senator Rothfuss was getting at. So if 43 passes, then you're going to have to make a decision during the session of which bill you run and which bill becomes the alternative. You cannot run both of them, and that's just my opinion on the bills for the future. So, sensing you're ready to vote, question being called. We're voting on 25 LSO 0043, Enhanced Oil Recovery Severance Tax Exemption as amended.
Senator,
Heather, if you would call the roll, please.
Senator Cooper?
Aye.
Senator Ellis? Aye. Senator Jones? Senator Rothfuss? No. Representative Banks?
Aye.
Representative Conrad?
Aye.
Representative Heiner?
No.
Representative Knapp?
Aye.
Representative Larson?
Aye.
Representative Lawley?
Aye.
Representative Tarver? Aye. Representative Western
Excused?
Co-Chairman Dockstader?
Aye.
Chairman Burkhart?
Aye.
That passes.
Okay, so we've passed 25 LSO 0043, Enhanced Oil Recovery Severance Tax Exemption as amended. And we are a little ahead of schedule. Anyone need a break at this point? Okay, then we'll continue. As people know, yeah, we just keep chugging along. So next thing for our consideration, oil and gas produced water. Consideration of Bill Draft 25 LSO 0039. Brian, why don't you walk us through that bill?
Yep, so you should have draft 0.4. This is 12-01 in the meeting materials. This is a bill that the committee requested in May based on information that the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission provided at that meeting. All this bill draft does is to provide that the commission may regulate non-commercial produced water pits, among other types of pits, to include those pits that aren't located on leases, units, or communitized areas. And to do that, all this bill draft does on page 2, lines 14 and 15, is strike the reference to wells on a lease, unit, or communitized area. With that, Mr. Chairman, stand for questions.
Any questions for staff? Okay, Director Kropatch, please. You requested this bill. It falls to you to explain it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom Kropatch, Oil and Gas Supervisor for the Oil and Gas Commission. As Mr. Fuller said, all this does is strike that language on a lease, unit, or communitized area, and just as a kind of a brief reminder of why we requested this, it would help facilitate water reuse among operators, especially in the horizontal plays in the Powder River Basin, who want to build centralized reservoirs to store produced water so that they can reuse that water for drilling and hydraulic fracturing and other well stimulation operations. Instead of having to lease them or site these reservoirs on a lease or communitized area, they can put them in a location that better facilitates reuse between areas they're drilling and reusing the water. So it would help facilitate that. It doesn't facilitate sharing water between operators or anything like that. These would be single operator reservoirs. It doesn't transfer water or anything in between those operators. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd just take any questions related.
Senator Rothfuss?
Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
saw you playing with your microphone earlier, and I've come to realize that's the sign you want
It's
to speak.
indicative, it's the sign, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to be clear, you still have the capacity to fully regulate, is this appropriate, all of the conditions, terms and conditions, so to speak, of the pit, so nothing is changing with that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that's correct. They'd still have to do our permitting requirements and operate the reservoir in compliance with our rules and regulations.
Great, thank you.
Other questions for Director Kropatch? Okay. All right, thank you. Committee?
Question. Call him. Do pass.
Move the bill. Move. Moved by Lawley, seconded by.
Mr. Chairman, public comment.
Oh, thank you.
Yep, no
Public
worries.
comment on this bill. Thank you very much. No public comment? Anybody online? Okay.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, if you'd identify yourself, please.
Yes, Carrie Agan, resident of Buffalo. I would like it noted that I had my hand up to make public comment during 42, and this was ignored.
So was there, one moment, please. Was there? Okay, it's my understanding you were introduced and declined it twice.
I received no notification, as far as I know. Now,
Well-
maybe I didn't see it.
Yeah, it's a technical issue that we can't address. So do you have a comment on draft number 0039?
No, thank you, sir.
And I'm sorry about the technical issues. It's just kind of the nature of what we deal with daily. So thank you very much.
Thank you, I understand.
Okay. No one else? Okay. Thank you for that reminder, Senator. Okay. Moved by Lawley, seconded by the co-chair. Discussion on the bill. Representative Tarver.
Mr. Chairman, without this bill, are they unavailable to, or unable to do the pits? I guess I should ask Mr. Kropatch that.
Mr. Kropatch, please come back up.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tarver, we can permit these pits now. They've just got to be located on the lease or in the unit. And so it requires operators build more of these reservoirs to try to reuse the water. Requires more transport, versus if they could locate it centralized to their future operations, they could reuse that, they could use that pit in for more opportunities in future drilling and completions. So they either build more infrastructure now or they don't reuse as much of the water. This would allow them to centralize that facility for their new, or for all their future operations in that area versus having to keep them on a lease or in a unit.
Okay. All right, thank you. Other questions? Okay, comments? Amendments? Question being called. We are voting on 25 LSO 0039, Oil and Gas Conservation Commission regulation of pits. Heather, please call the roll.
Senator Cooper?
Aye.
Senator Ellis? Aye. Senator Jones? Senator Rothfuss? Aye. Representative Banks?
Aye.
Representative Conrad?
Aye.
Representative Heiner? Aye. Representative Knapp?
Aye.
Representative Larson?
Aye.
Representative Lawley? Aye. Representative Tarver? Aye. Representative Western, excused?
Excused?
Co-Chairman Dockstader?
Aye.
Chairman Burkhart?
Aye.
That passes.
Okay. We have adopted 25 LSO 0039, Oil and Gas Conservation Commission regulation of pits as presented. Okay, moving on. So we are on enhanced oil recovery, blue oil. And that, Director Whitman, you're up. And I don't think we're looking at a bill. I think we're looking at a good presentation from the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this will dovetail nicely with some of that earlier discussion about enhanced oil recovery. With CO2, I did take the liberty of adding some general slides and reminders that might be helpful with that discussion earlier. So today I'd like to just give you basically a 30,000-foot overview of this discussion about blue oil and exactly what that means, the carbon-reduced oil. On this slide here, as I said, I'll start with just a little brief overview of CO2 EOR in Wyoming. We currently have 7 CO2 EOR floods that are shown in green on the map. 2 projects in development shown in pink. I think a particular note, this may have been brought up earlier, in regards to the 3-field Melaleuca cluster, those 3 pink fields up near Gillette, Halverson, Raven Creek, and Dillinger Ranch. That project is moving forward quite well. They've received notice basically from Exxon of an agreed to letter of intent to deliver CO2 to that project. They should have that hopefully even next week. That's operated by TR operating out of Denver. And just for your information, that 3-field cluster estimates of close to 65 million barrels available through CO2 EOR from those 3 fields. And the operator does intend to potentially add an additional 2 fields for CO2 flooding right in that same region. So that project's moving ahead quite nicely. In addition, which is not shown on the map, we did just recently, EORI sign a confidentiality agreement with a new company coming to Wyoming that purchased 2 fields for CO2 EOR, and those more in the central part of the Powder River Basin, with estimates of close to over 50 million barrels recoverable from those 2 fields. One having no previous water flood, so there's huge upside in those 2 fields. Just those projects alone, you're talking well over 100 million barrels recoverable. On the next slide, we have discussed in the past, but I think it's important to realize that production from CO2 EOR is all incremental production, production that would be or has been left behind. So this is all upside to the state, revenues from severance taxes that would not be coming to the state without some form of tertiary recovery, CO2 EOR or chemical. So a reminder also that CO2 EOR brings significant revenue to the state. And again, this revenue would be unseen without CO2 EOR. And I think to look at this blue oil discussion, it's important to keep in mind that the CO2 EOR system is a closed loop system. This closed loop system and understanding that is a critical component of the science behind low carbon oil or blue oil as we're talking about today. So on this next slide, this closed loop system assures that all CO2 that's injected into the reservoir will be permanently stored in that reservoir, which allows CO2 EOR to receive those 45Q tax credits that we were talking about earlier. The operator of the field purchases CO2, which is delivered by pipeline. It is injected into the reservoir. It assists in bringing out the stranded oil to the surface, where the CO2 is separated out from the oil stream and re-injected. So you have a closed loop system. That advances that process until oil production reaches a level where the project is no longer economic. But it is, as was mentioned earlier, very common to see field life extension of over 30 years using CO2 EOR. I think it's also important to note on that system, you will get to a point in the field where they are no longer purchasing CO2 and only using the recycle until everything is stored in the reservoir. So again, to introduce the science of blue oil or reduced carbon oil, it is important to recognize this closed loop system for CO2 EOR. On the next slide, what is this blue oil and what are they talking about? I think the essence is that through the process of producing oil using CO2, more CO2 is sequestered or stored in the reservoir to produce a barrel of oil, then the CO2 that will be emitted using that barrel of oil. There are a number of factors that determine the carbon footprint of oil produced through CO2 EOR. Oil produced through CO2 EOR compared to conventionally produced oil will be reduced or low carbon. That could be carbon neutral or even carbon negative. Currently in Wyoming, all the CO2 used for enhanced oil recovery is produced at ExxonMobil Chute Creek and sold to the operators through contracts. In all CO2 EOR floods, the CO2 is permanently stored in the producing reservoir. The carbon footprint of oil produced in this case will be lower than oil produced without CO2. Denbury Resources advertised that 25% of the oil they produced is Scope 3 carbon negative through the use of industrial sourced CO2. They referred to this oil as blue oil. So what is Scope 3? If we go to the next slide, greenhouse gas emissions are classified into 3 types or scopes. As illustrated on this chart, greenhouse gases include CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. Scope 1 includes all greenhouse gas emissions by the reporting company, so their facilities, their vehicles. Scope 2 are indirect emissions associated with the company's energy use. Scope 3 emissions are all downstream emissions from their product, which includes the combustion of oil. So you can see on the chart, there's a lot involved in calculating Scope 3 emissions. I should point out Oxy also has done a lot of work to look at their emissions profiles. On the next screen, the next slide, blue oil headlines. These are headlines that have appeared related to blue oil. In the case of Oxy, the headline states that they will sell net zero oil to a Korean refiner. There isn't much additional information provided, but it is largely anticipated that that net zero oil that they're referring to will be produced through CO2 from direct air capture. However, take a look at that Denbury headline from 2022 JP Morgan Energy Conference. Denbury positions itself as a leading producer of low carbon oil, and that 25% of its oil production is Scope 3 carbon negative. So looking at the chart on the screen, the left axis shows CO2 emissions in pounds per barrel. The yellow areas show Scope 1 emissions from direct development and operations at 70 pounds per barrel. The Scope 2 emissions are from indirect emissions of utilities and electricity, estimated at 90 pounds per barrel. And their Scope 3 emissions from transportation, refining, and combustion of petroleum products at 1,000 pounds per barrel. So again, these are Denbury calculations, and they calculate that for every barrel of oil they produce using CO2 EOR, they're injecting 1,700 pounds of CO2 that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. So this is industrial sourced, like at Chute Creek. And they are estimating for each barrel that they produce, they're injecting 1,700 pounds of CO2. So looking at their numbers, that 1,700 pounds of injected CO2 per barrel and stored, minus their Scope 3 emissions of 1,000 pounds per barrel, minus their Scope 2 emissions of 90 pounds per barrel, and lastly, minus their Scope 1 emissions of 70 pounds per barrel, that equals a net negative carbon emission of greater than 500 pounds of CO2 per barrel produced, or as they state, net carbon negative oil. On the far right side of the chart, you can see an estimate of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions from a conventional oil producer of approximately 1,100 pounds per barrel. So basically what they're stating is that without CO2 EOR, these companies cannot claim a reduced carbon or low carbon footprint oil. You don't have the offset. On the next slide, let's take a look at a Wyoming CO2 flooded field. So this is Beaver Creek Field over by Riverton. Looking at Beaver Creek, EORI did some calculations to look at this field specifically. And one reason we chose Beaver Creek is because we have the data that we need to do these calculations. So looking at that graph, based on total CO2 sales, this is what they would have purchased from Chute Creek since 2008, when CO2 flooding started at the field. We estimate that approximately 10 million tons of CO2 has been stored at Beaver Creek. From that graph, you can see that in 2008, the production at Beaver Creek was roughly 300 barrels a day. And through CO2 injection, the rate went to over 5,500 barrels a day. So incremental production, that green shaded area, through CO2 EOR is roughly 16 million barrels since 2008. Converting tons to metric pounds, this equals approximately, in this case, 1,400 pounds of CO2 injected per barrel of oil produced, slightly lower than the number that Denbury used company-wide. From the previous slide, scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions that Denbury noted are approximately 1,200 pounds of CO2 equivalent per barrel. So in this case, we can see that more CO2 is sequestered at Beaver Creek than the company's total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Again, carbon reduced, carbon negative blue oil. I would point out that there are challenges, and I think most of you would agree, you've not heard much about blue oil or companies looking at blue oil, and I think there are a number of challenges why this is occurring. One being most oil companies have not even released or done this kind of study on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, so we don't have data or anything to use to calculate carbon footprint of oil, companies that don't have that data. But I think it is very safe to say that any oil production from CO2 EOR is at a minimum lower carbon oil. And I think this committee is aware that in Wyoming, there's been a lot of work done, particularly the west side of the state, on natural gas and clean natural gas, which does receive a higher market value. We don't have that for blue oil. There aren't markets available where you could sell your oil at a premium due to the lower carbon footprint, but perhaps we could see that in the future. So that was basically just to give you this overview and 30,000-foot view of the blue oil and that discussion that you hear occasionally, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions for Director Whitman? Any questions? So, Director, I do have one. You talk about Denbury, and since 2022, Denbury has been bought out by Exxon. Do you know if Exxon plans to continue Denbury's work on this, or what that might look like?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We had a very good meeting, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Commission at Chute Creek with Exxon in June. It was very insightful. They showed us their plant expansion, and this is probably a good place to mention that as well. I think you're aware that current delivery sales volume from Chute Creek is at 340 million cubic feet a day. That was a number they confirmed at our meeting. They're doing a current plant expansion that I believe is a $400 million expansion. And by June of 2025, an additional 120 million a day will be available for CO2 or storage. We did discuss, to the degree they felt comfortable discussing, about the acquisition of Denbury. They pointed out that 2 fields from Denbury will be sold. One is currently in a data room, that Hartsog Draw field, which shows up on that map of potential CO2 floods in pink. That is in a data room, and they didn't disclose the second field that was going to be sold. That was about all they discussed on how their plans are evolving with Denbury.
All right. Other questions? Okay. So, Director Whitman, we alluded to it in previous discussions on the EOR bills and that. What does the infrastructure look like for CO2? You said Exxon's going to produce another 120 million cubic feet a day, but if the pipeline is already full, what are they going to do with it? How do we make use of it here?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good question, and I appreciated that conversation earlier about the infrastructure limitations. What I have always understood, and I think it would be a worthy to spend a little more time with this, the question of capacity on that Exxon line is often debated. What they have said to me is their capacity limited due to compression, not due to volume. So there is a volume increase potential on that pipeline, but it would require additional compression. So I think the infrastructure question is one we should probably investigate much more thoroughly. I think that would be a great option for the commercial pipeline advisor at ERI that presented earlier this year on the Pipeline Corridor Initiative, and investigate more fully this question of transport capacity through the existing system and what potentially could be needed.
Okay, because Mr. Whitman, I guess I would have some concerns about increasing compression on that line, considering a large portion of that line is fiberglass. And that then feeds into the rest of the system. And, you know, the fiberglass was used initially because it was high volume, low pressure. But if we start upping the pressure, that's a concern to me for potential line leaks, ruptures, and that line has been buried in the ground for 40+ years now. Do you know if they would plan to upgrade that line along with the increased compression?
Mr.
I know these are questions, Director, you probably can't answer, but it's just my train of thought right now.
Mr. Chairman, those are good questions, and you're correct. I really can't answer that, but I think it's worth investigating that whole area of infrastructure and limitations.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Yeah, so, Mr. Whitman, I hear you say that our infrastructure is falling short. How do we study that? How do we go about doing that? Is it a directive from this committee or the legislature or through your specific assignment? How do we find out how short we are in infrastructure?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think we could potentially do an overview of the capacity and limitations as they are now, and then see how this committee would like to move forward with it.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chair, Committee, maybe I'll jump the gun here a little bit. Senator, if you just give me a moment, if we could ask you to go ahead and do that, be ready to kind of at least present a concept at the October meeting. Okay, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is something that Representative Tarver and I were talking about at the last meeting, and it was the idea of trying to really get a handle on this, not just at a high level, but, and a high level next time would be great, but working on putting together a detailed report where if we, the state of Wyoming, were going to build out CO2 pipeline, you know, from a theoretical level, what would that look like? What phases would we do that in? Where is the best cost value? How much would it cost to get to the Bighorn Basin? Those types of questions. What would that really look like? And then as step two, how do we make that happen? So we've talked about this before, but we've never had step two. How do we make that happen? And, you know, before I got on the Minerals Committee, a short time before, and before you got on, was when the state really pushed things to get the Ruby Kern pipeline, and it took some action by the legislature through the infrastructure authority to get, or the pipeline authority, excuse me, at that point in time, the pipeline authority, to get that done, and we ended up nudging the private sector enough that you know, hundreds of millions to billions of dollars were spent. I think we're at a point now with CO2 pipeline where we might want to be going down that same type of path. First of all, understand the problem. Second, what do we have to do to make it happen? What resources from the state might provide that impetus, as we did with the Ruby Kern? Can we use the Wyoming Energy Authority's bonding capacity? All of those questions. So a high level would be great for next time, but I think maybe next time we want to have a conversation about what resources are needed in a budget to really do this study so that we have the answers to those questions, and then we have a strategy moving forward on how to implement it to ensure that CO2 resources are available throughout the state of Wyoming. So not just addressing the one pipeline, but where should we have other pipelines, and how should we have an integrated plan moving forward? So that was something, and I looked at Representative Tarver, we talked about that at the last meeting as being something that we should try and contemplate, and this is a good forum for that discussion.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate Senator and Representative Tarver for initiating that discussion. Maybe we could use Mr. Whitman's high-level study to begin with, and then put together that plan, as the good senator just explained, and have a destined goal to get this situation corrected and improved. But I think Mr. Whitman's initial approach would give us a better launching pad.
Okay. All right. Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to agree that I really think we need to move forward in a stepped way here to get to a solution. Obviously, I've raised several times due infrastructure, because I think it is an element we have to address, and it's going to take some steps to get there. So I appreciate the senator's suggestion and would happily help.
Okay. Great.
Yes.
Okay. Director
Mr. Chairman,
Whitman,
I
think
might
you
just add
have
one-
some direction. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we'll get this overview report put together with as much information as we can get. I might just make one point on that three-field Metallusa cluster that we discussed earlier in pink up by Gillette. I can tell you that the spur line for that operator from the Green Corps line is over $80 million. That's just the actual pipeline. So there's feed studies, lots of additional work. So when you talk about the costs for these CO2 floods, they are enormous.
So with that, any public comment on enhanced oil recovery, blue oil? Okay, anyone online? Okay, one person online, please. I'm sorry, what was that? Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, if you would identify yourself for the record, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. My name is Carrie Agin. I'm a resident of Buffalo, and I apologize. I keep forgetting to say that I am a geologist. So this is my comment for this section, but it also applied to 42. CO2 is not a pollutant. It is plant food. We need more of it in the atmosphere, not less. There's been an increase in plant matter across the world of about 14% over about the last 100 years, with a relatively small increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. The most productive use of CO2 is actually in the atmosphere where it feeds plants, well, and also in EOR. CO2 is not waste, nor is it a pollutant. The state of Wyoming should be incentivizing the release of CO2 into the atmosphere, not as capture and sequestration. Perhaps the state should calculate the real costs versus benefits of CO2 capture and sequestration versus the price of increased crops produced that feed us. Thus perform a real cost benefit analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Agent.
Thank you.
Right? Any other public comment? Okay, with that, I'll close public comment. I don't think we need any action. I think we've already given the director some direction for the next meeting in October. So, okay, with that, we are, according to my clock, 3 minutes ahead. We had set it for an hour and a half for lunch, and after yesterday's experience, I guess that's appropriate. So with that, I think we are recessed for lunch. We'll be back in at 1 o'clock. Okay.